So what we'll do, we'll start with some questions to each of them. There's instructions on your tent cards if you'd like to text questions in. We won't be going through the audience at the end of the session and doing live questions. So if you have questions, we will get to those, but just follow the instructions on your tent card and text those to the number indicated, and then we can get to your questions, but we'll be able to do it just without having somebody in the audience with the microphone. We'll go ahead and begin with a question to Senator Hoeven regarding this administration's impact on energy development in North Dakota. We've just gone through a change in administration, and I'm curious if you could give us your thoughts on what impact those changes in this administration might have on energy development here in North Dakota.
Well, I think it's been very positive because the administration and the Congress has worked very hard to reduce the regulatory burden. I want to start, though, by thanking all of you for coming out this morning. It's great to have you here. I know we got a lot of legislators, and so first, all the I was going to try and go through and recognize all the legislators, but there's enough here that I can't do it. So all the legislators, come on, stand up and wave so we can see who's here. Legislators. All right, good. Yeah. And I see Jager back there, and I always recognize him because if you open up the dictionary and you look up the definition of Secretary of State, there's no words there, just a picture of him. So I recognize him right off, and I saw our outstanding Attorney General, and I always recognize him in case I ever get in trouble with the law. And so it's always good to call him out. Who else? Doug Goring, he's absolutely the best Secretary of Agriculture in the state of North Dakota at this time. There's no doubt about it. He is. And he's a real live farmer. I see Julie Fedorchak there with the PSC. Did you bring your compadres? All right. What other statewides? Oh, well, he doesn't count. Oh, yeah, there is Randy. Randy Chrisman, good to see you. Wendy, what other statewides am I missing? Huh? You're sitting in the back. Did you scope any others out? Oh, Josh Gallian's here, our state auditor. Josh? All right. If I missed any, I know Heidi or Kevin will, or LT, you better know in your job, man. Lieutenant Governor's got to know that. So I think I pretty much used my 10 minutes. That was easier than thinking of something smart to say. So, but I'm serious. We have reduced the regulatory burden in a whole lot of areas. You know, whether it's waters of the U.S., you know, whether it's the clean energy plan, which is now the affordable clean energy plan. You know, whether it's the hydraulic fracturing regulations, you know, whether it's methane rules, you know, just across the board, but also the ability to permit and site infrastructure. The Dakota Access Pipeline. I mean, we're moving 500,000 barrels a day to the East Coast, to those refineries out there near Washington, D.C. And if they don't get the lightest, sweetest, best crude in the whole world from North Dakota, they're getting it from OPEC, right? But that made about a $7 a barrel difference. Instead of moving it out there on rail for $10 to $12 a barrel, now we're moving it for about $3 a barrel. So when we're going head to head with OPEC, that's pretty important. But think of the impact that's had, and you all know it as well or better than anybody. I mean, we started our EmPower energy plant here in North Dakota in 2002. And we are an energy powerhouse, whether it's traditional energy or renewable energy. More than 1.2 million barrels of oil a day. The only state that produces more is Texas. People think of Alaska, you know, as an oil powerhouse. That's more than twice as much as Alaska produces, right? So just to put it into perspective, we are an energy powerhouse, but to continue to do that and to not just provide this nation with energy, but to compete globally, I just gave you an example there with OPEC, we need a federal government that empowers us the same way that our North Dakota energy policy, Empower North Dakota, has helped empower all of you great leaders and so many others in the energy industry here in North Dakota. Thanks, Jason.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Heitkamp, let me ask you a question. North Dakota is proud of its all-of-the-above energy policy. So how do you bring that policy or that approach to North Dakota, working, talking to people on both sides of the aisle about the importance of diversity or that all-of-the-above approach to our federal system?
I woke you all up now. One of the things that I think is...
You saying I put him to sleep?
No, I didn't, John, no. One of the most important things that we can give to any industry is certainty, and not just 2 or 4 or 6 year, but long-term certainty, so that when you're making decisions that the policies that you see today are going to be the policies that you can count on into the future. And so one of the reasons why I think it's so critically important that we continue to speak in a bipartisan way about the energy needs of this country is that we build a policy that has more permanency than the next election. And that's why I think we've done great work on waters of the United States. The administration rolled it back, stream protection rule. But I have long been an advocate that we need to legislate in these areas, and we need to legislate to certainty. That's why I joined Inhofe and Barrasso, and me and Joe Donnelly have a bill that would permanently define waters of the United States, so we're not in and out of litigation. We're going to be in and out of litigation on the power plant rule. We're going to be in and out of litigation on the water, on WOTUS. We're going to be in and out of litigation on all of these things. And you can argue about what does that do, but the one thing we all know is it doesn't give you permanency. And so we need an energy policy in this country, and that energy policy has to be broader than just the idea of today. It has to be all of the above. And it has to look at, more importantly, not just sources of energy, but infrastructure. John raised the question that I think is so important, which is how do we move what we can produce here, whether it's by rail, whether it is by pipeline, whether it is high voltage transmission lines. If we don't answer that infrastructure question, we will be landlocked in terms of the energy that we have. And one of the things, I think when you go back and take a look at it, we have to look up. We can't just be fighting last century's battles. And I think many of you in the coal industry have come in to visit me. I say one simple thing: look, if you want my vote, you got my vote. If you want my leadership, let's think creatively about how we can move things forward. That creative leadership has led to 45Q. It's led to an expansion where we think we can be near carbon neutral in coal-generated electricity. That will go a long way, not only to meeting the needs of low-cost energy, but it'll go a long way towards making sure that coal has a permanent place within the energy mix. We also need to use our other resources, whether it's solar, whether it's wind, whether it is natural gas, and we're seeing this competitive disadvantage that coal has against natural gas utilization. If you had told us 20 years ago that natural gas prices would be consistently $3 or below, we would have said it won't happen. In fact, we used to have a federal policy in this country that you couldn't use natural gas to generate electricity. That's a policy that was probably well-founded at the time, ill-founded now. And so we need to be flexible, and we need to be bipartisan in how we approach this if we're going to give you the certainty that you need to make long-term investment decisions. North Dakota has an incredible legacy of energy, whether it is in biofuels, whether it's in ethanol, whether it is in wind, and yes, solar, geothermal, yet untapped, coal, natural resources, crude oil. You think about it. But we have to look at the challenges of today. One of those challenges that we looked at was the 40-year ban on oil exports. No one thought we could get that done. And in fact, my quest to do that started on this stage, which is kind of ironic. And within a year, we had that done in a bipartisan way. Wasn't easy. Wasn't easy getting it done in the Senate. Trust me, no one thought we could get it done. But when we make the argument for energy and energy dominance and energy independence, and when we make the economic argument about who we are and how we can give energy security to our allies, we win. So we need a policy that is embraced on both sides. And I think that if you look at the things that have been done that no one thought could get done, they've been done in a bipartisan way. And so having people to speak for this industry on both sides takes the politics out of what we do, and hopefully gives you the permanency and predictability that you need to build and invest for the future. North Dakota's future is incredibly bright. And I will tell you this, I think one of the main reasons why it's bright is not only are we blessed with a great resource, that's important, a lot of states have a great resource, we have the most innovative, advanced thinking citizens in the country. People who are given a challenge, who roll up their sleeves and get it done. And if we walk away from that and simply say today is good enough, we aren't going to take this any further, then we'll be behind again. And so, I'm proud of the work that we've done on energy. I think that there's much more work to be done. And I think that North Dakota is on the cutting edge, tip of the spear, of not only utilizing the natural resources that we have, but basically moving ourselves forward in the innovation and the technology. EERC, it was interesting. I was just at the Clean Coal Conference, the Kirk Conference, and I see the guys are in the back there somewhere. Saw EERC here. A woman came up to me who was working in the area of carbon capture, and she said, just met with your guys from EERC. She said, you need to tell people what they're doing, because they're amazing. And so we're quickly becoming a place not only of bragging rights for resources, but we are becoming a place of bragging rights for technology. And I think that's where the future of North Dakota energy is.
Thank you, Senator. Congressman Kramer, you've got a spot over in the House, different perspective from the senators. I'd be curious, what would you say are the most significant accomplishments in energy over the past few years?
Yeah, thanks, Jason. First of all, a couple of other celebrities I want to address. First, my former colleague, Tony Clark, is here. I know he's probably, he's the smartest guy in the room. We all know that. Former Public Service Commission colleague and a mentor in many ways, and of course, former FERC commissioner. And I would say, oh, by the way, I also want to welcome Dan. The Deputy Secretary, not in the room yet, I don't believe, but Dan's a very good friend. He and I traveled to Kazakhstan together on a presidential mission to attend an energy conference there, and then, more importantly, to talk to media in that area about what's going on. But welcome, Dan, and look forward to visiting with him here in a little bit. In terms of accomplishments, the senators have talked about a couple of them. I would say the most significant accomplishment for the energy industry and good environmental law in the last several years, frankly, has been the election of Donald Trump to the presidency. I had the opportunity to work with him during the campaign on energy policy. I had the opportunity to debate Trevor Hauser twice. That was Hillary Clinton's advisor. A good guy, smart guy, but a very different vision for America. Certainly energy dominance was not their aspiration. And so I'd say that's the most significant single accomplishment. Now, some things were being done prior to that. Certainly the lifting of the oil export ban, which never made sense in the first place, but certainly didn't make any sense in today's environment. But I want to just go through a few things since the president's been president. It took him until the second full day on the job to clear the way for the Dakota Access Pipeline, the Keystone XL pipeline. After years, nearly a decade with Keystone being stonewalled by the previous administration, he did it in one day and cleared the path so that while we still have barriers in certain spots, at least it's up to the states and not up to just a wall put up by the federal government. We do have a Waters of the U.S. Definition. The late Justice Scalia wrote a beautiful one. I've had legislation that we've passed a number of times in the House that does exactly that, defines it the way that Scalia defines it. And we have it as part of the Farm Bill that's in conference now, and all three of us are in the conference. I'm sure we'll all be working hard to keep that in the language, in the Farm Bill, in the final product. So several other accomplishments. I'd have to say there's still plenty of work to do, but the rollback of regulations of all types. The ACE, the Affordable Clean Energy Rule, is a great replacement for the Clean Power Plan. I'd say the one area that we aren't providing the certainty we need to, although I'm grateful to Ryan Zinke, and I've worked closely with him on the BLM flaring rule. That rule, we had the opportunity, and in the House we passed a CRA, went over to the Senate, as you know, came up one vote short, and now it's been mucked up in legislation or in litigation, which is what happens when you don't legislate. We had the opportunity to legislate, end it, kill it once for all. It was an overreach of BLM authority, clearly. But now we have a new rule that's going to be, again, hung up in litigation for a long time. And it's having a direct impact on North Dakota. Right now, that rule is keeping us from producing as much oil as we can. And the lag of infrastructure to be developed is going to keep us for a while from getting that upward trajectory we need on development. But let me add one other thing. Just this last week, a major accomplishment for environmental law in this country was the confirmation of Judge Brett Kavanaugh. There is no jurist in recent history, probably none in the whole country, that has written moral opinions and dissenting opinions as well as majority opinions on environmental law than Judge Kavanaugh. Environmental law important to North Dakota. He's dared take on Chevron deference. Now, no offense to any bureaucrats in the room, but he literally opined that deference was a shifting of power away from the Congress, the elected officials of the country, to the bureaucracy. He's actually opined in certain cases, he's referenced even and questioned Massachusetts versus EPA. Do you know how few jurists are willing to take on that fundamental problem? He's opined on cross-state pollution. This is something Tony and I were dealing with on the commission, and I'm sure commissioners today. He wrote important decisions on that. Probably one of the best decisions I've read that he wrote was a dissenting opinion, interestingly, on the DC circuit, where he was the one vote, and one of the other two was the Merrick Garland, who would have been on the Supreme Court, but for Mitch McConnell and the Senate keeping him from getting on the Supreme Court to replace Scalia. And his dissenting opinion on Stallion Energy Center, the White Stallion Energy Center versus the EPA, was that the EPA did not adequately consider the costs of mercury emissions rule. Now, while it was the dissenting opinion, it became the majority opinion at the United States Supreme Court when Scalia used his dissenting opinion to get a 5-4 vote. So, the opportunity for energy dominance has never been better, and we need to seize this moment, I believe, with this administration. I wish we could do a lot more legislation. We're going to continue to do more legislation. But in the meantime, it's good to have a Supreme Court now that has a majority of people that understand that states are the right place for most environmental and energy law and rules.
Thank you, Congressman. Lieutenant Governor Senator Heitkamp made a first reference to our workforce. I know you're engaged in the workforce issue here in North Dakota. What challenges would you say are created by our workforce shortage as ways that we can grow out our energy industry?
Thank you, Jason. I also like to step back a second and just mention a couple things that we've seen as an administration. I'd like to put a big exclamation mark on is the communication that this new administration has brought. And in talking with Ron Rauschenberger, who's here as well today, with the difference, he saw the difference between previous administration, current administration, on whether they're communicating with us or not on a daily, weekly basis, asking us what these solutions look like on a local level, on a state level. And we've made a lot of inroads that way. Whether it's being on Royalty Policy Committee, where we're able to put our 2 cents in, our opinions in, on what we feel should be happening on the federal lands, and also conversations at the BIA level of looking at the real solutions needed, where the bottlenecks are at on the flaring challenges that we have on the reservations. So there's been a lot more communication, very healthy communication, and a lot more to look forward to. But specifically on workforce, as most of you in the room know, workforce challenges is a main priority for Governor Burgum and our administration. The Main Street Initiative is around that. It's settled. It sets around the challenges that you as employers have of placing new employees, recruiting employees, placing them in communities. Is it a place where they want to stay? Also, the education transformation committees that the governor's put together, the task forces. Basically, your higher ed governance and your K-12 innovation task forces are looking at ways to deliver trained employees to workforce, to the industry, helping provide those opportunities for our children, letting them know what's here. Also for the kids that come in from out of state, what type of opportunities are here? What kind of opportunities are there for you to stay, make a career in North Dakota with high paying jobs, as we all know. Workforce challenges are providing very tangible negative results to this at this point, with simple fact of a gas plant behind construction by many months because there's not enough welders, pipe benders, etc. You think about that, what's that doing? That's reducing the barrels that are produced on a daily basis, because with our very responsible flaring regulations we have in place, if they can't get rid of their gas, they've got to slow down production, and it's directly attributed to workforce. And the other one that Lynn Helms brings up a lot is we haven't been able to fill out frac crews for the last couple of years. As we've ramped up, the governor asks me all the time, why is the rig count so low? Why, if you look at that chart that the DMR has on rig count the last 4 years, why is it very flat the last 3? A lot of it is not only do they have their leases held, and so their production is not at quite that level of exuberance that we saw when they were trying to hold the leases, but the workforce is not here to fill those frac crews. So you have one less frac crew, that's that many less wells that are drilled, that much less production. We look at that from a revenue standpoint from the state, also from a jobs availability standpoint. It's really hurting us. It's really holding us back. So again, thank you for asking the workforce question to us. That's one that's a very high priority for our administration.
Thank you. Back to you, Senator Hoeven. I heard a reference to the EERC. How can the federal government best support some of these technologies that are being developed right here in North Dakota, including those related to carbon capture, but there's a lot more going on. So your perspective on that.
Well, I see John Harju out there sitting, and so I'm going to defer that question. Come on up, John. You can answer that question a lot better than I can. Everybody in the room knows it. I'm really not kidding. You know that, right?
Yeah, we all know that.
So in the Energy and Water, I serve on appropriations, and one of the subcommittees I'm on is Energy and Water. And we included funding for the cooperative agreements with the EERC, Energy and Environmental Research Center at the University of North Dakota, which is the preeminent, really, college of energy development in the country, from the standpoint that they don't just teach it in the classroom and they don't just experiment in the lab. They actually go out and do it. They do demonstration projects that lead to full-scale commercialization. And of course, they are now at the very epicenter of carbon capture and storage. Nobody is where we are in terms of CCS. Not only the fact that we have the coal-fired electric companies, both investor-owned and RECs, that have the latest technology, both in terms of energy conversion, converting coal to electricity, and supplying it to about a, 10, 12 state region throughout the entire Midwest, but also the latest, greatest stewardship. And then you combine that with our water resource, with Lake Skakawea and the Missouri River, and of course our mine-mouth coal, lignite coal. Our oil industry, which affords us the opportunity to put carbon down hole for tertiary oil recovery, and the fact that we're the only place that's already doing it through the Dakota gasification plant, converting actually coal to synthetic natural gas, methane, and then capturing the CO2, condensing it, putting it in the pipeline, and sending it to the Weyburn oil fields for tertiary oil recovery. So, in terms of carbon capture and storage, the issue isn't technological viability, it's commercial viability. Commercial viability. Heidi just talked about what's going on with natural gas. I mean, we don't drill for natural gas. It's a byproduct. It's almost basically free, right? We drill for oil and produce huge amounts of natural gas. And so the coal industry is competing with that natural gas right now. Think of how that's driven the cost curve down. So we have to continually get better and better at converting coal to electricity at lower and lower cost. At the same time, we're supposed to capture CO2 and make money so we can stay in business. That's the reality. That's the reality of what we're doing. So EERC is right in the middle of figuring out how we connect all those things, right? We have to connect all of those things. We have to connect the technology, the resource, all the things I'm talking about, and make CCS commercially viable. And when we do, it will take off like hydraulic fracturing, right? And it won't be just in this country. Think about China and their need to be able to do just what we're talking about. They're going to be all over our technology. They already are, right? But this is where we're going to crack the code. And so I mentioned being on energy and water. We included funding for both Project Tundra, which is back end, and Alum Cycle, which is front end funding to combine with the state of North Dakota and the Lignite Energy Council, LT, you and your crew, along with the Department of Energy, which is why it's great that we have Kevin's buddy, Dan Burley, here, right? You're going to put your arm around them and make sure that they're in our partnership, along with our great energy sector, and we're going to make this commercially viable. We have, going all the way back to the olden days when I was governor, we started, and I see Rich Wardner right there, and our great legislators. We've put the regulatory scheme in place. We have the regulation on pore space. We have the legal structure in terms of what companies' responsibilities are when they put CO2 downhole for not only now, but for years in the future. What is their responsibility? Is it a manageable liability so you know what your costs are? So we can do it from a legal and regulatory standpoint. The EPA, I think it was in April of this year, gave us federal clearance. Now what we need to do, though, is to pass my Regulatory Certainty Act, which takes 45Q. So you have the tax credit, which is very important, reconcile EPA and IRS regulations, so we can not just put it down whole in pore space for just sequestration, but we can put it down whole in Class 6 wells and generate another revenue stream to achieve what? Commercial viability. So you can do it and stay in business because you're making money, right? That's the code that we're here to crack, and we're going to do it. We want DOE's. It's not coincidence that Dan's at this conference. It's not coincidence that Rick Perry was out here a few weeks ago. It's not coincidence we're putting money in the fossil fuel energy research program. It's part of a vital partnership that will help us do this. This is so important for our country, but will have international ramifications in terms of the future of how we produce and consume energy in this country and beyond.
Thank you, Senator. Let's continue that thought because I know you were involved in 45Q that was included in the Budget Act. Senator Heitkamp, if you could talk for a minute about the importance of that tax credit and what Senator Hoeven is talking about.
I think we got it. You know, it's an interesting kind of journey because I don't think, again, anyone thought we could get this done. But we started out, as I said in my opening comments, believing that there had to be a part where we could get to a bipartisan consensus on carbon capture, sequestration, and utilization. And so how do you do that when you have a deeply divided Senate? People on one side who only care about climate, people on the other side desperate to make sure that we have a future for coal, consider myself over there. And you look at this, and so I said, you know, we're not as your senator, we're not going to win this fight. This is a fight that's going to go on for a long time, and maybe at some point we achieve some kind of consensus of where we are with climate. But if we make the goal technology, if we set out and say this is the single most important thing we need to do, which is develop commercial scale technology. And, you know, coming off the Dakota Gas board, I mean, I could easily say, look, I've seen it. I've seen carbon capture work. I've seen that where CO2 can be an incredibly valuable byproduct. You know, everybody forgets that Dakota Gas developed the CO2 project not to deal with any kind of environmental regulation. They developed it because they knew that it was a valuable byproduct. And they could move it up to the Weyburn field in a conventional field, and as John said, recover more oil in a tertiary system. And so we knew that we had a valuable byproduct, but we pulled together, you know, a very disparate group. Sheldon Whitehouse, who gives it from Rhode Island, very concerned about sea levels rising, as you can imagine. I think the average elevation change in Rhode Island is about a foot, right? And Mitch McConnell, last Congress, and now this Congress, John Barrasso, Capito, Shelley Moore Capito, and me just said, look, we can get this done. And we not only got this passed, but we got the Use It Act, which is ready to go out of the Senate, which will give us infrastructure that we need to haul CO2. So why is this important? I think it's important because we have to come to consensus on those things that we can agree on, because that's where your permanency is. If you think 45Q is something that just one side does without the other side, then you know, the next time somebody else has the reins of power, it switches. So how are you going to make a major investment relying on that tax credit if it's a partisan tax credit? And so we build to the center to try and figure out where those sweet spots are. And I will tell you, the additional add-ons that John's talking about, and that we spent a lot of time talking to Al and talking about new source performance standards. But we've got to maintain the fleet that we have, and we've got to make it possible for somebody to have the certainty to build a new coal-fired power plant. So how many of you think there's a new coal-fired power plant on the drawing board right now in America? Well, you'd be right. Not one of you raised your hand. You know why? Because no rating agency and no investment banker is going to give you billions of dollars to do it without regulatory certainty. And regulatory certainty doesn't come without bipartisan agreement. And we cannot have our energy policy that needs to be long-term swing, you know, in the wind based on election. We've got to have 20 years of commitment, whether it's in infrastructure or whether it is in research and technology. We've got to come to terms, and that's why 45Q is critical for carbon capture, sequestration, and utilization. It has put United States on the forefront of dialogue right now, and that's important, but it is just one step. It's one step, and the most important thing that I can say about 45Q, beyond the opportunity that we have now to really commercialize this technology, is that it was bipartisan. And a bipartisan tax credit is a permanent tax credit that we can rely on when you're putting pen to paper to try and develop and figure out whether these projects are going to work. And so, you know, I'm proud of the work that I did. I had a lot of help from a lot of people in this room who've been supportive. We really, I mean, and I want to give a shout out. Shout out to Arch Coal, to Peabody Coal, and Cloud Peak. And they took a lot of grief from their others in their industry on 45Q. They've taken a lot of grief because the people believe that it's a retreating from the resist any change. And they stepped up to the forefront and said, we think the future is here. And I think that we've got a great coalition with Kirk to move this forward. I just spoke at their hearing, or at their meeting. That group goes bigger and bigger, and the technology gets even more advanced. And so what I said there is if you had talked about clean coal 6 years ago, you've been laughed out of the room. If you had had environmental groups who were now working on clean coal, you said we have environmental groups who are now working on clean coal and carbon capture sequestration, you'd have been laughed out of the room. And if you said we're really looking at a commercial scale CO2 air capture with conversion of CO2 into a marketable product, you'd have been laughed out the room. But 6 years later, these are all things that we're talking about seriously. And so we can, if we stop the resistance to change, if we stop the resistance to developing technologies, if we start talking to each other, we can do amazing things in this country. But we can't do it by simply picking a team.
Congressman Kramer, there's a couple thoughts there when Senator Hoeven was talking about the Class 6 wells. That was a North Dakota priority. So what else can the federal government learn from North Dakota's approach to energy development?
Well, to answer the question with a very short answer is just turn the whole federal energy policy over to North Dakota and the world would be a much better place. Unfortunately, to Heidi's point, not every place in the United States is like us. So we have to deal within those realities. You know, the very first bill I passed that I introduced that passed and was signed by Barack Obama only had one vote against it. It was by the Libertarian in the House. I don't think he thought there should be a federal government, so he just voted no. But and the way we did it, it was the streamlining. It was a bill that John had actually introduced in the previous Congress that streamlined the permitting process for infrastructure on federal lands. And the way I was able to bring Democrats along was to demonstrate to them that by streamlining, we didn't have to cut corners. And by streamlining, by synchronizing really the permitting process and putting all of the entities, and of course in the Bakken there are a lot of them. It's the BLM, it's EPA, it's the Corps of Engineers, it's USDA, and everybody else that has a piece of it under the same roof, doing things at the same time rather than each of them taking their 60 to 90 days, lining it up over the course of several years. You had the advantage both of streamlining the process, but also of the synergy of each other, you know, working together, and you can shorten the time frame. And the way I was able to bring the others along on the other side of the aisle was to demonstrate that while we're doing it in a shorter time frame, there's actually more oversight. I think the same thing can be true with the argument for 45Q. So 45Q was extended, as Senator Hoeven said, and it benefited one company in one state because of the peculiar definitions, the lack of harmony between the IRS and the EPA. And so Occidental in Texas gets to take advantage of 45Q. In John's right, his bill, and I have the same bill in the House, would take care of it if we can pass them. Interestingly, though, I think to Heidi's point is how difficult this is. My trouble in the House was not with Democrats; it was with conservatives because they see a tax credit as lost revenue or as a handout. So I had to score it. We finally got it scored and found out that you realize that the tax credit for storage is $50 a ton. The credit for utilization is $30. It actually scored favorably. But it takes a bunch of smart people with pencils and calculators to figure that out. And so here we have the perfect experiment in North Dakota. We have both. We have both. And John's exactly right. When CO2 is treated like a commodity instead of a waste product, the market works. And people that want to capture more CO2, the left, they ought to be for it. People who want to have a longer lifespan for coal-generated electricity and an oil patch ought to be for it. Can you imagine the utilization of CO2 for enhanced oil recovery? It makes the existing wells last longer, making it less need for more wells. So there's an environmental win as well as a market win in this, as well as a revenue win in 45Q. So the good news is, Dan, I wouldn't be surprised if he talks about this. He and I have talked about it a lot. I've had every undersecretary in the DOE in my office to talk about the reconciling of this. The DOE's provided good guidance. The EPA has provided good guidance. We're working closely with Secretary Mnuchin on the final rule. So it's two tracks. Yes, we want the certainty that comes with legislation. In the meantime, we want to get good guidance by the experts and get a good rule. And hopefully we can see it change soon.
Great, thank you, Lieutenant Governor. Assuming this all works, what does increased production in the Bakken look like? Whether that's driven by CO2 or not really doesn't matter, but what does that picture look like if we can increase production?
Well, Doug had a great time presenting on this at the 2 times in the last week or week and a half, Petroleum Conference and IOGCC over in Idaho as the 2019 chairman. So we'll have good leadership on that board as well. It's very important. But a lot of people in the room realize that him putting out the 2 million barrels per day was greeted with a little bit of skepticism, but those in the industry knew that's something that is possible. And as we rolled forward 1 year, he took great joy in seeing at the Wilson Basin Conference the charts that are zooming up towards 1,700,000, 1,800,000. And the current status, I would tell you, is, I kind of alluded to it before, but not only workforce constraints, but also that flaring capture. What's going to keep us from hitting those numbers? it gives us great hope, the dialogue that we have at the federal level as far as carbon capture, as far as the investments here from companies in this area that are looking at Project Tundra. The other side of the equation is the investors on the oil side looking at purchasing those older wells and able to use that CO2, finding out that we can't even produce enough CO2 here to do the job that could be, that John Harju and the folks at the ERC is seeing that could actually happen to bring out more oil out of that rock. I mean, it's a very exciting future, but we have constraints. We have constraints on the federal lands with being able to get right away to get the pipe in the ground to get the gas out of the federally controlled areas, the tribal controlled areas. We have getting this technology moving forward with Project Tundra, how to get off of square one, how do we get off of home plate onto first base, second base, third base. The future is incredibly bright here, and if you follow geopolitics and the oil markets, obviously the price is going up, and there are folks that are worldwide looking at North Dakota and Permian as having to be the swing producers, having to fill that gap when we have other areas like Venezuela, Iran, those production areas declining in production. So there is pressure to do this here, and we know what to do, but the constraints are strong right now with workforce and with capture. But I can tell you, just driving around Western North Dakota as often as I do, when I'm back there for the weekend, what might have you, it's something where it doesn't look like an area that needs a lot more. So this is a challenge. You have to balance this with the folks that live there. You have to balance this. I just had a conversation with the Ag Commissioner the other night. You have to balance this with landowner fatigue, with pipeline fatigue, and the local zoning jurisdictions, the local building inspectors, and the local. You go to the county commission, you go to the city councils, what are they seeing? So it's a balancing act when our Bakken happens in such a small geography. So there's a lot of challenges there, but the opportunity is amazing. There's a lot more oil to be had. When we're already talking about getting 16% of the oil out of the rock versus 5 to 6%, we know there's a lot more opportunity. We just have to have the takeaway capacity and those value add projects coming online. One of the things that we talk about with EmPower is, not only the wind and coal and solar and how they all play in the same sandbox, but what happens when gas-powered electricity becomes something that has to happen when you have this much gas being produced here, and it is competitive in the market at this point. How do you get that online in the grid? So then it's a John Wida conversation, transmission authority conversation. What does that look like? Does that help balance with a continued wind production? Is it gas? Is that the other side? I could talk for a long time about this. I value my time on EmPower. I think that the three up in front are probably very glad to be in a congenial atmosphere like there is today. People like Brandenburg could be in the same room with the coal guys. Let's not talk about indirect wind mitigation impacts, Mike. But we can get a little bit heated, but it doesn't end up being what we saw in DC. So I want to thank Senator Hoeven and all of you that were involved in this in 2002, bringing this to be, and also 07, 09, increasing the permanence of it. And those of you that still serve, we're going to get started with our meetings again in October and November and continue these conversations moving forward. So thanks for the question, Jason. We have a bright future.
Thank you. Back to Senator Hoeven. You recently brought Secretary Perry out to North Dakota. Why was it important for you to get him out here, and how did that help him do his job better?
Well, really, because of what I talked about earlier, and that we are really putting all these things together to do CCS, and it's important for us, it's important for the country, and it's going to have global ramifications. Really the same, I mean, we really cracked the code on hydraulic fracturing, and again, it was about making it commercially viable, and we continue to make it better. And look how, even down in Texas now, they've gone back into the Permian and the Eagle Ford and all that, and now they're doing so much in horizontal drilling and directional drilling. When I started as governor, we produced less than 100,000 barrels a day. Less than 100,000. And now over 1 million too. So I mean, that's the potential we're talking about. So I wanted him out here to see it. Now, he and I were governors together for a long time, so we know each other well. he understands oil and gas very well. He understands coal very well. They have lignite coal in Texas like we do. They're doing some of the same kind of things on coal conversion with gas and so forth and carbon capture. So he knows it. My number one objective in bringing him out, and frankly, my number one objective in having Dan here today, is we want this partnership. So just like Rich and his crew have worked with the Lignite Energy to fund money through the research and development effort into a partnership, we need a federal government, a state government, and an industry partnership to do this, because you're talking hundreds of millions and billions of dollars to make it happen. But the upside is so amazing. That's the investment that's going to unleash this torrent, I think, of investment globally once we get this to commercial viability. So that's why it was so important. But it goes way beyond that. When I talk about, or when we talk about North Dakota as an energy powerhouse, that's one example. How about the fact that right now, we're at the Spiritwood Energy Park, just east of Jamestown, okay? We, and I'm going to use that because it's everybody, are building a soybean crush plant. The number one soybean producing county in America is Cass County. Number one, okay? So we're going to take soybeans, we're going to crush them at Spiritwood, which is an ag energy technology park that's just going to keep growing and getting better. Right, Big Al? Am I right about that? Okay. Advanced cellulosic ethanol plant going up right now, alongside the ethanol plant, alongside a coal-fired electric plant, along with ag plants, okay? All of those, and now we're going to add this soybean crush. And Ron Ness, last I checked, that oil is going out to a refinery west of Dickinson, right? And it's going to be, and there's a $400 million upgrade going on at that refinery, and they're going to turn it into biodiesel that's going right out to Los Angeles, so when you follow those buses around, it smells like potatoes instead of gasoline, right?
But it's renewable diesel, not biodiesel.
Sorry,
Right,
LT,
Ron?
renewable diesel. The guy next to you knows what I'm, right? Is it Tesoro, is it Andover, or is it Marathon? I lose track. Yeah, it's Marathon today, isn't it? Another example, and I can go on. I can talk about how our coal-fired electric plants provide steam to the ethanol plants to produce transportation fuel, and they take the wastewater from the city and use it as a water supply. Or how about the fact that Dakota Gasification now is taking that low-cost gas and they're turning it into fertilizer, anhydrous and urea, that we formerly had to get from Malaysia, so we were absolute last in line and the highest cost. Now we produce it here and distribute it throughout the Midwest. That's not just a confluence of traditional energy and renewable energy, it's also the confluence with agriculture. Who does agriculture better than we do? Kansas likes to argue with us, but we know, and other places. My point is, that's the innovation, and it's not laboratory stuff. It's out there competing in the global marketplace stuff. And that's absolutely why I wanted the Secretary here and Dan here, because the federal government needs to be involved here. They need to be investing here. It's important for the country.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Heitkamp, this administration has proposed the Advanced Clean Energy Plan to replace the Clean Power Plan. You called the old Clean Power Plan misguided, as I think many of us agreed it was. Why was that problematic, and where does this Affordable Clean Energy Rule sit?
Well, I think first off, this is good news that they've proposed a new rule. We have the Massachusetts case, which led to a finding of endangerment. I think there's some people who were saying, look, are we going to reverse the finding, which then would result in no need for any regulation? So that was the first decision the administration had to make. I think even if you believe there isn't an endangerment, I think it probably, for certainty into the future, probably was a smart move to go ahead and continue to talk about what that regulation looks like. This administration has been much, 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 much more open to actually sitting down and trying to assess realistic targets, and then let the people who do the work to try and achieve those targets. And we knew, anyone who knew anything about distribution of electricity, anyone who knew anything about generation of electricity, knew the past plan was crazy town. It could not be implemented. And it couldn't be implemented because it just was ignorant of how electricity is generated. And so with that understanding, I think the flexibility that's being built into this new rule, we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens from this. But it goes back to what we all know is going to happen, right? And I'll tell you what's going to happen. This rule could be the best rule, the smartest rule, the most common sense application of the endangerment finding, and it still will go to litigation and finally find a friendly court that will stay the rule. Again, creating massive uncertainty. This is the problem. We cannot legislate, we cannot have public policy by litigation. And, you know, it takes 3-4 years, trust me, because I've taken cases to the Supreme Court, to get a case to the Supreme Court. In the meantime, you form shop, and you get the right district court judge, and you get the right result. We need to have a real discussion in the Congress about giving predictability. And so where I support the direction of this rule, it's in the comment phase. We expect that we're going to see some positive comments. I've asked many of our utilities to provide their comments so that we can reinforce and support those comments. But I think we need to sit down and have a meaningful legislative strategy that will solve this problem and give certainty. Because in spite of the administration changing, in spite of common sense now ruling on Clean Power Plan, we've got a situation where we still don't have permanency, and we won't have permanency. And so, you know, this is why it's so important that we take our job of legislating, you know, across the aisle, getting that coalitions built that can, in fact, achieve that 67, 68% majority. That means that you've got at least a long-term strategy in place. And so, again, happy that it's happening. I think it was smart not to reverse the endangerment rule because that would have just led immediately to litigation. I think that endangerment finding, but I think that we're going to be in litigation, and it means that we have to roll up our sleeves and solve this problem.
Thank you. I'll remind everybody that if you'd like to submit comments, just follow those instructions on your tent card. Congressman Kramer, I'd be curious in your priorities for the remainder of this Congress, what do you have in the works for us?
Sure. A couple of things. One is I also have as a high priority.
Turn them all off except for mine.
Yeah. This is Hovind's always in control, in case you're wondering. Always. I just yield right away. It's so much easier. I think a couple of things, Jason. One is this 45Q issue is really important. Also, along the same lines of building that bridge between today's coal and clean coal, you know, another high priority for me on the tax side is an extension of the refined coal credit. You know, we know it's used here. We know that depending on when you got it, it's expiring for various people, entities using it. We're working on a 10-year extension. It may very well happen yet this year in a lame duck session in an extender package. I hope it does. There's some argument over whether it should be another 10 years or a few years. Now, I'd like to be able to allow new applications as well. That's part of my legislation. So that would be a high priority. I think we have to get back, and I'd be interested to hear what Commissioner Clark says about this at some point. I'd like to get back to Secretary Perry's resiliency plan. I think for regulators to not find a way to appropriately value 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week electricity is a big strategic mistake. I know it's nice to think that, you know, that intermittent wind and solar are going to keep the lights on all the time, but when they don't, it's going to be a big problem, and we have to find a way to recognize that and use it in rate base. Now, I also think, and I don't know if I'd put this in the high priority category, but we have to take a hard look at PURPA, for all you utility nerds. I mean, I don't even think PURPA really has a place in today's market situation. But at the very least, we ought to refine it because you've got way too many people, way too many developers gaming the system and putting our utilities, I think, at great risk. So I think we have to deal with the resiliency of that grid. And that, by the way, to President Scogan's point in his opening comments, that certainly includes the cyber side, but it also includes, you know, having the power, having the fuel sources, nuclear and coal certainly are the two biggest ones, while gas has a place, obviously. We have the same problem. In fact, I remember when I was debating Trevor Hauser, the idea that gas was the bridge fuel to some other technology, except that his candidate said it's a bridge we need to cross very fast. Well, you don't make multi-billion-dollar investments on bridges you're going to cross very quickly. And therein lies some of the problem. Even gas, as cheap and abundant as it is not proven to be a great 24-hour, 7-day, base load fuel, because a lot of people don't want a pipeline to the generating facility, and not to mention that there are a lot of other utilization for natural gas, not the least of which is, by the way, export opportunity. So I'd say that those would be among some of my highest priorities going forward.
Great. After this question to the Lieutenant Governor, if there's any questions that have come in by text, I can get to those. If not, I've got a couple additional ones. Lieutenant Governor, you talked about communication before. I'd be curious about why that is important from the state perspective as they're dealing with the federal government, and what could we do better?
Well, I don't know what the ratio is, but at times it feels like half of our lands are administered under federal government. And so, but whether it's a coal lease, whether it's like I've spoken previously, the BIA, trying to get through the myriad of regulations of a EIS process when there might be as many as 11 different EISs. And Secretary Zinke's out, it's not only the different branches, not only the Corps of Engineers and BLM and such, but then within Interior there might be 5 or 6 different ones that are competing with Fish and Wildlife, with BLM, with what have you. It's paramount to have that communication. So I feel like we're probably spoiled to have had this communication compared to our predecessors. And like I said before, Ron told us what it felt like to not have someone on the other end of the phone when you're trying to have this conversation. And not only in the resolution of the DAPL protests with immediately jumping into supporting the rule of law and allowing law enforcement here to help get in and have a peaceful resolution to that issue, but to have willing partners at the BIA talking about what are the real solutions to getting right away through the reservation, so that it's not just rhetoric in the newspaper about where people are offended when you're saying the flaring is so high on the reservation and we don't have a lot of solutions. Well, we do know what the solutions are from having that closer dialogue. It's very key moving forward, and hopefully whatever happens in the midterms here keeps that dialogue fresh. Hopefully we have more bipartisan reaching across the aisle, like Senator Heitkamp's talking about, where these things can be addressed for the good of all. We do know that the price of oil is going up. As soon as the price of electricity starts going up, then all of us are concerned as well. When we're paying more at the pump, more on our electricity bill, then everybody's very concerned. So I believe we all need to be pushing together, and it's not something that's just sustainable without communicating. It needs to be really broad, robust communication from the federal government. We've got a lot of solutions that we're looking at here, as we mentioned earlier, and so how do we bring those forth into the future? There's going to be a really interesting window the next 5-10 years as nuclear power comes offline, as some of the older non-mine mouth coal plants continue to have efficiency issues and such, trying to be competitive in selling their power every day, and a large need for energy production in the United States is coming our way. And North Dakota's looked at for leadership in that regard, as always. We're looked at as an area where we are willing to produce the energy here. We understand how the power gets in that light socket. Our citizens are not against generating the power, so what is it going to look like? And we need to have a very robust conversation with other states and with federal to make that happen.
Great. We'll go off script questions for a moment here, Senator Hoeven, and ask about the Dakota Access Pipeline. It's been some time now since we've been dealing with that as a crisis. What have we learned since then, and is there more to learn and more to do?
Well, that we need infrastructure and that it's challenging to build it. But we have to think about it in terms of, we want energy that's dependable. It has to be there when we need it, on a cold winter day or a hot summer day, not intermittently. But I mean, one of the things that separated our country from many countries in the world is that dependable energy supply for every aspect of our life and for commerce, for everything, okay? So we also want it to be safe as possible. I mean, we just expect that. We take for granted we're always going to have that energy whenever we need it, as much as we need, whenever we need, and that it's safe, absolutely safe, right? And at the same time, we want it to be environmentally sound, right? We all value the environment, clean water, clean air, right? We just take those things as given. But we have to think about, in order for that to happen, you've got to get that energy from where it's produced to where it's consumed. And you can't keep relying on energy infrastructure that's older than I am. And that's pretty old. We got to have the investment in the new infrastructure, don't we? And it's not a traditional energy, renewable energy fight anymore. Windy, you know, back when you were fighting for wind, because the only windmill I had were a few old ones on the farm, right? You know, now look at whether it's coal-fired electricity or wind energy. You need electric transmission, don't you? Whether it's oil or natural gas, whether it's coal converted to synthetic natural gas or gas we pull out because we're drilling all these wells in the Bakken, we've got to get that gas to market, right? And if it's oil, we got to quit hauling it. I mean, there is a role for train to move it around, but the most cost-effective, efficient, environmentally sound way to move it is pipelines, whether it's oil or natural gas. So it doesn't matter whether you're a fan of traditional energy, renewable energy, or both, or all of the above like we do here in North Dakota, okay? We've got to have the energy infrastructure. And even here in a state where we're all about energy, we're an energy powerhouse, as LT just said, it's getting tougher, isn't it, to site those transmission lines and those pipelines. But maybe because the whole energy industry needs it, renewable and traditional, needs to build that infrastructure. Maybe that'll help us break through and get people on board recognizing that we need to do this for everyone's benefit. And even for not just that fundamental benefit of being comfortable in your home, but competing in a global economy. Right? We have to compete in a global economy, and energy, low-cost, dependable energy, gives us a big, big advantage. So I think that's the message that comes out of Dakota Access or any other infrastructure project is we got to get together. We got to foster that understanding. As energy leaders, we've got to foster that understanding so people work together to build that energy infrastructure that this country so desperately needs.
All right, we'll go ahead and take another question from text.
Thank you. One of the first questions that came in is, do you see a carbon tax in our future?
I guess not if I can help it.
No.
No?
I'll defer to them.
All right, sounds good. Thank you.
Hopefully no.
We had a couple questions that focused on subsidies and renewable energy, and so I'll kind of combine them into one. But there were some concerns about or questions regarding subsidizing renewables with the timeline of also considering subsidizing baseload generation, and then how that also relates to Congressman Kramer, your statement last week that the war on coal is over. So I guess kind of wrapping them into one is, if the war on coal is over, then why is there still such a push for renewables and subsidies at the same time as subsidizing baseload? Sure.
A couple of things. First of all, the production tax credit specifically, the direct subsidy for renewable electricity, known to us most often as wind, obviously, is in a phase out. It was a negotiated with the industry itself. In fact, I'd say NextEra was probably took the lead on suggesting a phase out of the PTC, which was significant in getting it extended at all. When Tony and I were on the Public Service Commission, we were dealing with annual PTC extensions. Usually, it's sort of like the 179 expensing senators. You know, they do it in December, and you'd have to start, you know, in November to take the credit. And so the PTC was a very uncertain thing. We called for and strongly supported a 5-year extension so that provide that certainty. Interestingly, at the end of the 5 years, the certainty of the end of the PTC wasn't the certainty that a lot of people were seeking. They wanted another 5 years. And so all of that led to this negotiation of a phase-out of the PTC. I know that for the coal industry, that's challenging because even though we are now ratcheting it back and in a few years it'll be done, I expect it will be done for good. I really do. I don't see them coming back for another extension of that. So we have that certainty. But to keep up, to the point I suspect of the text, everybody else has to get something, you know, and to just have a level playing field, which would be great, a complete free market level playing field, let the market decide, that ship sailed a long time ago. I wish we could go back to that and just start over. You know, when I was an economic regulator, I always thought low cost was a really good standard. A really good standard. People often said we didn't have an energy policy before. Yeah, we did. It's called low cost. And people really liked low cost. But when people started demanding other things and advocacy groups in Congress and other places were pushing for things, you end up with this mishmash of a very complicated tax code that provides incentives. But my point to the war on coal is over is that, let's face it, the world is very different looking forward in the coal industry than it was 2 years ago, when we had a president who ran on the promise to bankrupt coal companies, to cause utility rates to necessarily skyrocket. I mean, those are aspiring goals of the Obama administration. That is over, and we have rolled back a lot of regulations. And I believe the FERC, given its sort of its legal regime, wasn't able to take Secretary Perry's resiliency plan and make it work in that context, but I do think they remain committed to finding a way to appropriately recognize the value of baseload electricity. And so, yeah, unfortunately, we're in this competitive situation for who can get the most subsidies how fast, rather than a situation where we get a level playing field based not on more subsidies, but rather based on free market principles. But it's just the reality of the world we live in.
I think it's fair to say the war on coal is over, but what does the future for coal look like? And those are two different things. And even though there's been a very, very heavy emphasis on renewing interest in the coal industry, no one's thinking about putting new coal generation online. No one's thinking about what we need to do. And it's not just driven by renewable credits, but I will say one of the things that we've talked a lot about here, which is always interesting me, is state-based regulation. One of the great challenges that we have with coal is that we see more and more high population states introducing renewable standards within their energy mix. And so when you look at California, it's one state in the count, but it's, 10% of the population. You look at New York, you look at Minnesota, and our utility companies have to generate and plan for those individual states. And so in spite of this idea that the tax credits are driving it, a lot of what's driving this is looking at what's the ethic, or what is, it's been a long time since we fought externalities in Minnesota. And we knew that these renewable fuel standards were coming into existence. We could see those challenges moving forward. And so we've got to produce to the market that we have. North Dakota can't consume all the energy that they in fact generate here, so we've got to be taking a look at where those markets are. So what I would say is, again, the future of coal has to be in maintaining the fleet that we have right now. That we've got to deal with new source performance standards so we can upgrade. We've got to take a look at a lot of the issues that we've been working with the coal industry on that provide that bridge to that new technology. And then we've got to be talking about what is it about coal in the mix. Let's quit worrying about the subsidies. Let's talk about our competitive advantage. It's the certainty of pricing. In spite of natural gas, I said in the beginning, look, if I'm an old natural gas pricing tracker, I remember the 80s when it crashed after deregulation and no one would take your gas. And then I remember $11 gas. And I remember $3 gas on the Dakota Gas Board where you couldn't make it pencil out without byproducts. So I've watched this up and down. We are in a sustained period of low natural gas prices. Is that always going to be our reality? And Kevin mentioned the redundancy and whether we can move infrastructure to a gas-fired power plant. So we've got to argue, what is it that coal brings to our energy mix? And it clearly is the most redundant, reliable source of electricity. But we've got to produce to the market. And so what I would say, if I were king for a day, I would change all those renewable fuel standards to clean power standards, so that we could make the argument that coal, when we reduce the CO2 impact of coal, qualifies for those standards. We need to get back into those states that have taken their measure, maybe from the federal government, but have had a war on coal for a long, long time, beyond the Obama administration. Guess what? How do I know that? Because I litigated the externality case in Minnesota. This isn't new. And so we've got to look at the whole overall regulatory environment, and we've got to make the case that the coal-fired generation really qualifies for some of the best reliable, redundant, predictable cost electricity that we have. And let us do it, and let us do it with new technologies, with new developments, and we can make America powered by coal again. But we cannot sit here and try and try and look backwards. We got to look forward, and that's really a challenge. And so let's make our case. Let's make our case with new tools, which are new technology tools.
Okay, that brings us to our near conclusion. We're going to conclude with one final question to keep the number of questions even to the Lieutenant Governor, because Senator Heitkamp said a phrase that's interesting. If she were king for a day, Lieutenant Governor, if you were king for a day, what would be the one or two single things that we could do to make our energy policies better?
How much time do we have? Well, that's a pretty open-ended one, Jason. I was thinking about the challenge we have going forward with the prolific amount of coal we have, and the irony of how we use words. We get really hung up on words, and Senator Heitkamp was touching on this. So is it renewable or clean? What's the most important? It should be that it's clean. The fact that we listen to John, and we listen to Minn Kota, we listen to Elite talk about Project Tundra, and that would have a lower carbon footprint than everything else. And the question I ask at EmPower is, but will the Minnesota customer buy that power? They feel these electrons are still generated in a dirty way because of the perception that's out there against coal. And it's simply not true. If Project Tundra comes into being, if and when, that power will truly be clean. And so how do you get away from these definitions? It's kind of the same thing as when I corrected Senator Hoeven, because Ron Day corrected me quickly when we were meeting at the Endeavor, or now Marathon facility in Mandan, talking about this is not biodiesel, this is renewable diesel, and the renewable diesel is actually better. Actually can be commingled with regular diesel, and these are not things that you would hear in the media. These are not things that you would hear in normal conversation. But biodiesel has a definition, and renewable power has a definition. But clean power and renewable diesel are things that we actually have solutions for. And why would they be deemed to be dirtier than the other? So this is a public dialogue that has to happen, and it's not easy, but it has to happen. And when you have an 800-year supply of coal, that's getting pretty close to renewable, but it's actually, it doesn't fit the definition. Yes, yeah, longer than I'll have to worry about. So it's a public dialogue issue going forward, and I look forward to being part of it for many years to come. And thank you all for coming to this conference. It's very well attended, as always, very diverse group. And I was just thinking about the fact that the three of them are here. How many other conferences do we have where it's that important, where you have the entire congressional delegation? So thank you all for making time to be here, and thanks again. Hopefully you have a good day. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'd like to thank our panelists as well.
I don't know. We wanted to ask Larry that too.
You want us to open the blinds? I know, you're on stage and you can't even see out in the great view. That's okay.
That was, when we were born them, they could have been looking out the window.
All right, thank you very much. So good morning to everyone, and thank you for attending this year's Great Plains and EmPower North Dakota Energy Conference. My name is Retha Mattern, and I'm the director of the Great Plains Energy Corridor here at Bismarck State College. I also do have the pleasure of being the chair of this year's conference planning committee. So before we do take a break, I want to take a quick moment to acknowledge our sponsors this year, without whom, of course, this event would not be possible. This year, we do have 5 platinum sponsors. Those are ConocoPhillips, NextEra Energy, Hess, Endeavor, and Crowley Fleck. Thank you all very much for your support. Those sponsors are also listed in your program booklet, along with our gold and silver sponsors. At this point, we're going to take a 20-minute break. We'll reconvene for our keynote speaker at 9:50. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Josh DeMort. I'm the Director of Stakeholder Relations at ConocoPhillips in Dickinson. I manage our stakeholder relations duties for the company here in North Dakota and in Wyoming as well. I have the distinct pleasure this morning to introduce the Deputy Secretary. After his remarks, he'll be joined on stage by Dave Thompson, the news director for Prairie Public Radio here in North Dakota. He has been in that position since 1981. And under his watch, Prairie Public's radio service has won nearly 150 awards for news reporting. Dave is a native of Bismarck. Learned backstage. He's a graduate of St. Mary's High School. In addition to his news director and morning anchor duties, he's currently recognized as the Dean of the Capitol Press Corps, and according to his biography, has no plans to retire anytime soon. So before he comes on stage, let's give Dave a round of applause. It is indeed my distinct pleasure to introduce Deputy Secretary of the United States Department of Energy, Mr. Dan Brulette. Mr. Brulette was nominated to his position by President Trump in May of 2017 and confirmed last August. In his role, he serves as the Chief Operating Officer for the Department of Energy, directing a $30 billion annual budget and overseeing the work of nearly 100,000 federal and contract employees. Mr. Brulette has a long and successful career in both the public and private sectors. He's served as the Senior Vice President and Head of Public Policy for USAA, the Vice President of Ford Motor Company, where he led their domestic policy team, was the Chief of Staff of the United States House of Representatives Committee on Energy and Commerce, and served as Assistant Secretary of Energy for Congressional and Intergovernmental Affairs in the George W. Bush administration. Mr. Brulette is a former state energy regulator in his home state of Louisiana, having served as the Louisiana State Mineral and Energy Board, on that board from 2013 to 2016. Dan and his wife, Adrienne, are United States Army veterans, the parents of 9 children. Please join me in giving a warm North Dakota welcome to Dan Brulette.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you, sir. A very kind introduction. Whoops, I think we're gonna get some feedback here. Should I turn this off or should I turn the other one off? I'll try it. I'll move it out so it doesn't squeak. How about that? Thank you, Josh. What an honor to be here, and what a heck of a view. Wow, that is amazing. The senator was just talking about this in the back of the room. He said earlier, I guess the shades were closed and now they're open, and wow, it does make a difference. What a huge view. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you, and especially on this day, this particular day, a day of discovery. Thank you, Christopher Columbus. It's a heck of a day. And it's particularly pleasing to be here in North Dakota, in the country of the Rough Riders, and here in this land of abundant energy. I'm here to say thank you, North Dakota, for what you have done, not only for America's energy posture, but for America's foreign policy posture as well. And I'm going to talk about that just a little bit. It's fitting that if we are to be successful in shaping our nation's energy policy, and indeed in shaping the world's energy policy, we will need all 3 of the things I just mentioned. We will need discovery, we will need the spirit of the Rough Riders, and yes, we will need abundant energy. Because if we get these policies right, North Dakota will be an essential source of clean, affordable, abundant energy, and it will be, you will be, a critical state in showing America a way to a future of security, of prosperity, and of opportunity. We're already taking some very long strides toward that future, thanks to our discoverers and our innovators. Here's where we are today. Due to technological breakthroughs driven by innovation, the United States is now producing abundant, affordable energy from a wider range of sources than we ever thought possible. And we're using this energy more efficiently and more cleanly than we ever thought possible. The U.S. is now the world's leading producer of both oil and natural gas. This year, we're on track to produce an average of 10.7 million barrels of crude oil per day. Next year, that number is expected to grow to 11.4 million barrels per day, and the Energy Information Administration, part of the U.S. Department of Energy, tells me that that number could exceed 12 million barrels per day the year following that. The last time we were even close to those numbers was 1970. I was 8 years old, and I remember distinctly. It wasn't too long after that, sitting in a gas line with my father, wondering, growing up in Louisiana, wondering why I was sitting in the backseat of a car for him to fill up with gas in Louisiana, which was then a very large oil-producing state. Times have changed. They've changed dramatically. This year, we expect a natural gas production in the United States to exceed 81 billion cubic feet per day. And next year, we expect that average to exceed 84.1 BCF per day. Both of those are new records. Last year, our coal exports rose by an estimated 61% over the previous year. And the same technological breakthroughs that have driven production up and costs down for other energy sources as well, and they include renewables like solar and wind. Last year, while 2/3 of North Dakota's electricity generation came from coal, more than 1/4 came from wind energy. And overall, we expect wind generation to increase by 7% this year and 5% the following year. And we also expect solar generation to increase by 23% this year and 12% more than that in the year following. This is important because we're now sharing our energy abundance with the world. Last year, for the first time in 60 years, we became a net exporter of natural gas. And today, our exports are going to 30 countries on 5 continents, and they're counting. In 2 weeks, I'll be leaving the U.S. to go to Tokyo for the second time to attend the LNG Producer Consumer Conference. I can tell you last year when I was there, the line was out of the door. Companies looking to do business in the U.S., looking to buy U.S. LNG. I expect the same this year, perhaps even a longer line. 3 weeks ago now, I returned from Berlin, where I talked to U.S. companies there who are incredibly excited about ending the dependence on Gazprom, the Russian gas company. They're looking for U.S. LNG. Where are they going to get that from? From you. So my job as the Deputy Secretary of Energy is not only to help lead the department along with Secretary Perry and to serve as his Chief Operating Officer, it is also to promote America's energy abundance, and it's coming from North Dakota. In July of this year, Secretary Perry attended the dedication of what is known as the Cove Point LNG export facility in Maryland, which joins the Sabine Pass as the second major LNG export facility operating in the lower 48. 4 other facilities like that one are being built, and approximately 11 billion cubic feet per day of LNG export capacity are in various states of construction and operation throughout the United States. And, as I mentioned earlier, while we are exporting more, we are emitting less. From 2005 to 2017, while the U.S. economy grew, we also led the world in reducing carbon emissions, cutting them by 14% over that period of time. Another way to look at our progress is to note that between 1970 and 2017, the combined emissions of 6 key pollutants, and this includes sulfur dioxide, carbon monoxide, and nitrogen dioxide, dropped by an astounding 73%, even as the U.S. economy grew by 3 times. With carbon capture utilization and storage and other technologies that are now coming in online and into use, we can expect even further progress in that particular area. That's the good news. And there's more good news to come. I don't want to set this up to be a good news, bad news event. But we do have energy challenges. I want to talk about that. Because if you want to have true energy security, it is not enough to simply produce the energy we need. We must ensure that the energy we produce actually reaches its ultimate destination. We must ensure it's delivered without impediment and without interruption. And that's why it's so vital that we build more infrastructure. And that's why President Trump approved construction of the Dakota Access Project just a few days after taking office. And he followed that by approving construction of the Keystone XL pipeline. Both of these projects were important to North Dakota, and they're even more critical for our nation. Because if we choose not to build more domestic pipelines, we are choosing the energy problems that are currently being faced by our friends in the Northeast. As you probably know, New York has restricted pipeline construction, which has reduced the flow of LNG to consumers in that region. As a consequence, during last year's cold snap, they had to resort to buying fuel from Putin's Russia. Now think about that. We can clearly do better here in America, and we're doing it right here in North Dakota. But if we are to ensure our energy delivery, then even building more infrastructure, while that is absolutely necessary, may still be insufficient. We must also protect our existing infrastructure against both natural disaster and man-made hazards. The threat of cybersecurity is growing in terms of scope, frequency, and sophistication. And to combat this trend, President Trump recently released the country's very first fully articulated national cyber strategy, directing the federal government to ensure a secure cyber environment for all of America. And Secretary Perry has made cybersecurity an absolute priority at our department. He is working with both the public sector and the private sector to increase preparedness against cybersecurity threats to our energy infrastructure. It's also one of my highest personal priorities. As chair of the department's Cyber Council that formulates the best practices for protecting our department's national security assets, and for those of you who are unfamiliar with the department, we do a lot of energy work. We do a lot of research and development, especially in fossil and nuclear, but we also manufacture and safeguard the nation's nuclear warhead stockpile, some of which is not too far away from here, as a matter of fact. So cybersecurity is a very, very big deal for our department. That's why this past February, the department established what is known as the Office of Cybersecurity, Energy Security, and Emergency Response, or as we like to do in the government, we create an acronym, we call it CSER. That's what it stands for. That office is now led by an Assistant Secretary, Karen Evans, who was just recently confirmed by the United States office. That office is going to provide greater visibility, greater accountability, and greater flexibility in safeguarding all of our energy assets that the department is responsible for. And as we build out that office, we'll continue to look at our national laboratories to help us out-innovate, if you will, our adversaries, who are very, very aggressive and getting more so by the day. Besides creating CSER, we're also taking a number of other steps to improve cybersecurity. We've developed an initiative called ACES, yet another acronym, yes, Accelerating Cybersecurity in the Energy Sector. ACES is designed to address cyber gaps in the energy sector by doing a couple different things, 4 of them very specifically. We want to improve situational awareness of the energy infrastructure with the private sector. We're working closely with utility CEOs around the country. We're developing specialized teams within the DOE that are dedicated to energy infrastructure protection and response. We're also creating an integrated public-private facility to test the vulnerabilities. I mentioned our national laboratories. Idaho National Laboratory is at the forefront of this. What we're doing is we're having utilities share components of their grid. We take them into the laboratory and we test them for malign activities, for lack of a better word. When folks are putting together, when they're assembling these parts, we have supply chain issues that we must be mindful of. As we move, further and further along this spectrum and become more and more computerized, supply chain matters. So what we've done is we've dedicated the Idaho National Laboratory to test utility equipment to make sure that we're not contributing to our cybersecurity concerns. We're also going to enhance our federal and our state collaboration on cyber preparedness. It is very important for us at the Department of Energy to communicate the things that we see in the intelligence world with our state partners, our state PUCs, and our state leadership teams here in states like North Dakota. You can't act upon what you don't know, and it's very important for us to be very aggressive in sharing that information with you. Taking all of this together, building more infrastructure, protecting our existing infrastructure is absolutely critical to the future of energy. But even if we get both of those tasks exactly right, there's still one more thing that we have to do to ensure delivery. We must make sure that our power grid is resilient and it's more reliable. The President is absolutely right to view grid resilience as a serious national security issue. And that's why we're examining ways to better respond to and recover from intentional acts as well as man-made disasters. And as part of that effort, the Trump administration is considering the unique value that reliable fuels like coal and nuclear add to our grid resiliency. We're also continuing to find innovative ways to make fossil fuels cleaner. About 10 days ago, we announced a $30 million research and development project of transformational carbon capture technologies. The goal of these projects is to support the development of solvent, sorbent, and membrane technologies that will significantly reduce the cost of CO2 capture from coal-fired plants. It is simply not economical today. We must drive down the cost of this important technology. We're going to continue to pursue these efforts because while renewables are a fast-growing energy source, according to, again, the EIA, the Energy Information Administration, fossil fuels are still expected to account for 77% of the global energy use in 2040. That's why fossil fuels, along with nuclear power and renewables, are all key components of our all-of-the-above energy strategy. And by pursuing that all-of-the-above strategy, we can achieve both environmental stewardship and economic growth, and we can achieve a future of security, of prosperity, and opportunity. Yet to achieve all of this, we have to continue to get these energy policies right. And that means continuing to favor innovation over regulation. It means continuing to focus on incentives so that individuals have both the freedom and the reason to discover and create. And it means continuing to foster the incredible productivity and the ingenuity of the American people. That is our commitment. That is our determination across the entire Trump administration. Teddy Roosevelt, the original Rough Rider, once said, "We cannot do great deeds unless we are willing to do the small things that make up the sum of greatness." We're determined to do the small things to achieve big results. We're committed to getting every aspect of our energy policy right. And by doing so, by pursuing an all-of-the-above energy strategy, by protecting our infrastructure, by building more of it, and by shaping the policies that unleash discovery, innovation, and ingenuity, we can truly realize a future of security, of prosperity, and of opportunity here in North Dakota, here in America, and yes, all across the world. That's my hope for the future of energy, and that's our commitment at the U.S. Department of Energy. Thank you for allowing me to join you this morning. Hey, Emily. Hey, Dave. My honor to meet you. Good to meet you. All right. I'm going to steal some of this water, if that's all right. Thank you. Do I need to use this one or is the either one? I'll just leave it right here.
And,
There you are.
seem to be working.
You
Mr.
want to know how
Secretary, thank you.
nervous this is? You don't want to know how nervous I am to be with a
nervous
radio
you are?
star?
I would think on a scale of 1 to 10, it's probably about a -3.
I hear you're a star here. You're a hero here. Thank you for the good work you do.
I've just been around since, the Dead Sea was just becoming sick.
That's great.
Well, Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here. I just wanted to start with your all of the above strategy. That's something the administration has embraced. North Dakota has also talked about all of the above. Are there any barriers to accomplishing that? Do you see barriers that need to come down?
You know, I don't know that I would refer to them as barriers. I mean, maybe they are. You know, you guys are doing a great job here in North Dakota with all of the above. I mean, the things that you're doing in wind energy is phenomenal. The fact that you are still, you know, looking for and promoting clean technologies around coal is amazing because coal is such an important part of what we do here in the U.S. As I talked about just briefly, coal and nuclear in particular provide the baseload electricity generation in this country. I know there are some who may not want to recognize that, but that's true. It is what it is. Natural gas is a big component of that as well. The important parts around coal and nuclear, however, is that they provide a security that's not always, you know, prevalent or available with other forms of energy. So we want to make sure, the President has directed Secretary Perry, who has subsequently directed me, to look at every regulation, to look at every potential regulation that we have responsibility for within the U.S. Department of Energy and make sure that it doesn't, you know, represent a barrier to the development of these technologies. And we've done that. We're working closely with the FERC, which is somewhat of a sister agency with the U.S. Department of Energy. We talk to them almost daily, and we're helping them with things like LNG permitting. We're helping them with pipeline permitting. We're working closely with the U.S. Department of Transportation, looking at pipeline regulation to ensure that those things don't represent barriers. You know, we're also going to know that there's an active conversation in the Congress around taxes and tax credits in particular. We're going to look closely at that to ensure that those are not skewing or distorting, you know, markets across the country. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes.
But
Well, just to follow up, in the energy mix, you said coal and nuclear are really the backbones because they provide baseload power. So what is the future for wind energy and perhaps solar and maybe hydropower?
I think it's very bright. I think it's very bright. I know there's been an active conversation around the loss of production tax credits for the wind and solar folks. Look, I think the technologies are now at the point where they're becoming very, very mature. I was just in Saudi Arabia, and I was with Minister Al-Fallah, who is the energy minister for Saudi Arabia, and he shared with me some data on solar in Saudi Arabia. Now, keep in mind, it is Saudi Arabia. The sun does shine there quite a bit. But their latest auction had electricity at less than 2 cents per kilowatt hour. If that continues, and that's without, you know, that's not subsidized, I mean, that's 2 cents on the open market. And if that continues, then solar is going to become a larger and larger component of the world's energy generation. That being said, as I mentioned, it is not going to be overnight. It is not going to be, you know, in a week or two or a month or a year or even 3 or 4 or 5 or 10. 77% of the world's electric generation is still going, or energy consumption is still going to be, you know, reliant upon technologies that are on, you know, around coal and around nuclear. So we want to advance those two technologies.
In the earlier panel, one of the panelists, I think Senator Heitkamp, said, in her perspective, yes, the war on coal is probably over, but now the focus seems to be just keeping the fleet that's out there right now in good shape. So do you see a future for new coal-fired power plants?
I hope so. I hope so. And I think as we develop some of these technologies, that, you know, the hurdles will be overcome, the environmental hurdles that, you know, prohibit these new plants from coming online. There's also some market issues too. Look, let's face it, natural gas is abundant and cheap right now, so it's going to be a highly competitive market. So the costs need to come down on the coal side. The costs need to come down on the nuclear side in order to be competitive. But I hope that I hope our government will address some of the artificial barriers, in my mind, artificial barriers that may exist at this point. And that is, as wind and solar become more mature, it's unclear to me why, those subsidies might still be needed. And, as we saw in the Northeast, as we see in other parts of the country, if certain generation types are allowed to bring those subsidies into an open auction marketplace, you're going to have situations where literally the electricity is coming to market at below zero pricing. Well, in that environment, everybody else is uneconomic. It doesn't matter, what's going on. If folks can price their product at below zero, then everybody else is going to go away. That raises some really serious concerns for us at the Department of Energy. Resiliency matters. Especially as we saw during these hurricanes that just came through North Carolina and other places down in Texas where, obviously Governor Perry, he lived his entire life and served as governor for 14 years, but I lived there for 12 years as well. What allows that recovery to occur and occur quickly is the fact that we can turn the lights back on very, very fast. And for that to happen, you need base load electricity. You need base load generation. And, you don't have to be a MIT scientist to understand that, the sun doesn't shine during a hurricane, and you don't do windmills during a hurricane. You do baseload power. So the premature retirement of coal, the premature retirement of nuclear is a very serious concern for all of us at the department.
Let me just ask the question because hydropower has been talked about a little bit, as a renewable energy. Do you see a future for hydropower in the United States?
Building dams is going to be a bit of a challenge in the current environment. But is there a role? I mean, we run the Bonneville Power Administration, BPA, up in the northwest part of the country, and hydropower is a very important component of what they do. So I don't want to say that it doesn't have a future. It clearly does. I don't know that I can suggest at this moment in time, unless there's some state that wants to take the lead on this. I don't see it as sort of leading the forefront on renewables. It's a very important component of what we do. It's especially critical. I mean, the mention that I made earlier about the cold snap up in the Northeast. Much of the electricity that was provided by the Canadians to help Boston and other major Northeast cities make it through the cold snap is provided by hydropower. It comes from Canada, but a very important component of our overall energy posture.
Going back to coal again for a second, you talked about the idea of carbon capture.
Yeah.
Here in North Dakota, we're talking about enhanced oil recovery using
Sure.
carbon dioxide to enhance oil recovery in the state. We've got the Saskatchewan project that's been going on with the Great Plains Synfuels plant. Is clean coal likely, number one, and number two, are there other uses that DOE sees for captured carbon?
Yes, clean coal is possible, very much so. As I mentioned, though, we have to get the cost down. And that's what we're trying to do at the DOE, is to find technology, to find innovations that will help us bring that cost down. I was able to see, we have a facility down in Texas called Petronova. It's a natural gas facility that has demonstrated the viability of the technology. So we know it works. The question is whether we can get the economics right. And we're working with that particular company to look at the field that they're using it on to help, increase the production using this carbon technology to increase the productivity of the field itself. We're working with them to help them learn more about the seismic activity that goes along with this. Do I think it's viable? Yes, I do. We saw this in Saudi. We saw this in other countries. We know it works. We just got to get the economics right.
And a little bit along that same line, since you mentioned Saudi, the U.S. has now become the world's top oil producer.
Mm-hmm.
What needs to happen to keep the U.S. on top?
Keep doing what we're doing. Keep doing what you're doing. Because it's you that's driving this equation. It's not us at the U.S. Department of Energy. We play a small part in it with research and development. I'm going to go see some of that when I leave here today here at this university. So we do our part, but it's really you. It's really the energy industry that's going to maintain the American leadership that we currently enjoy in energy. I think, if I had to take a step back, I think we're now at the point where people actually see the impact of what you're doing here in North Dakota. They see it from an economic standpoint. They obviously see it in their wallets. They see it in their, in their checks every week. I happen to understand personally what this means because I grew up down in Louisiana. One of my very first jobs was as a pipeline welder. That's what I did. When times are great, I knew what that meant. When times weren't great, I knew what that meant too. And I think folks understand it in ways that perhaps we didn't understand it back in the 70s when I was doing this. But I think also they see the impact of the work that you're doing here in North Dakota and what it means to our foreign policy. This president and every future president, if we are able to sustain this energy posture, will be able to fundamentally change our stature throughout the world. And they will be allowed to make decisions without one and sometimes two of their hands tied behind their back. It gives us a strength in these conversations around the world that we didn't have just 5, 10 years ago. I think that's very, very important. American people see that.
Here's a simple question that might be opinion more than anything else. Is OPEC less powerful than it used to be?
Without question. Without question. As I mentioned earlier, growing up in Louisiana, I remember distinctly, sitting in a gas line and asking as a kid would ask, why? And the reason why then was because we were subject to supply disruptions. And are we still subject to those supply? Yeah, I guess you could probably argue that we are in some case, but not nearly to the extent that we were then. Not nearly to the extent that we were. And I think as long as these production numbers stay where they are, we are going to be driving the oil markets throughout the world.
You also mentioned about the resiliency of the nation's power grid. It's a real concern, and there's going to be some infrastructure perhaps. What is the administration thinking about in terms of a power grid infrastructure that needs to be done?
We think that we need more. We want to see more interconnections between states. We want to see more interconnection between countries. I was just up in Canada meeting with the energy minister there. Canada's been a great partner. We share electricity across our borders, easier in some cases than perhaps other countries. We have some interconnection with Mexico. We'd like to see that increase. We think we have to have redundancy in our transmission grid, our electric grid in particular. As we look at these cyber threats, as we look at these nation-state actors that are coming after our grid and our critical infrastructure in particular, we want to ensure that there's redundancy in our system. The pipeline system in particular is becoming more and more dependent upon communications and upon electrical switches. And, the times have changed. When I grew up on a pipeline, we used to do everything manually. You go out there and you turn the valve and you close the valve and you come back home at the end of the day. Today, all that's computerized. It's all, it's all electric. Well, that makes it subject to cyber threat. And as we look at the grid and as we look at the pipeline structure, our fear is that we don't want to have one pipeline take off 2, 3, perhaps 4 or 5 electric generation facilities. So building redundancy into our system and incentivizing that redundancy, we think is very important and a prudent thing to do.
On pipelines, are the regulations now in place that it will be easier to put pipe in the ground?
We think so. We think so. FERC just had an important decision. The government loves to study things, and we love to require studies before we make any decision. We were having situations where FERC and the U.S. Department of Transportation were doing redundant studies in order to allow a permit to proceed to the next step in the process. Working with FERC, and I have to thank them. They took the leadership role here. They decided that if the experts at the Department of Transportation conducted their study and did the proper review of a permit, it wasn't required to be done again at the FERC. Very common sense sort of step, but an important one. Because as you go through this process and you start to hire these, $1,000 an hour lawyers to get your permit approved, it becomes quite expensive very, very fast. So thank FERC for doing that. We think it's a great first step. I can tell you at the Department of Energy, for things like LNG export facilities, if anyone here has been through that process, for small scale LNG in particular, we would require an economic study to be done before we would grant the permission of the applicant to go to the FERC to actually get the permit that they needed to build a facility. So, Secretary Perry and I looked at ourselves and, he asked me the obvious question, and I returned the favor by asking him the obvious question: are you an economist? He said, no. So, are you an economist? He said, no. We said, well, why are we doing economic impact studies if neither one of us are economists? What's the Department of Energy need to do that for? And the answer is we don't. We don't need to. If an investor comes forward and they want to put their investment and their capital and their money at risk, the market is going to tell them if they've made the right decision a heck of a lot faster than anyone in the government will, or anyone in the U.S. Department of Energy will. So we simply eliminated that requirement. It's a small step, but it allows the applicant to go right to the FERC to begin the permitting process. We're going to continue to take those steps all along the entire course of this administration. We just think they're common sense steps to do.
Are there any new forms of energy that DOE is at least have something on the drawing board at this point?
Well, we're looking at hydrogen very closely. When I go to Tokyo here in a few weeks, I'm going to attend what's called the Hydrogen Council. It's made up of some government people from around the world, as well as a lot of private sector investors and developers who are looking at hydrogen as potentially a next source of energy. Very, very excited about that. On the nuclear side, we're continuing to study fusion. Very important energy source if we can figure out the technology. It's very complex, very dangerous, in some respects if you don't understand it. It's the power of the sun. So you think about that, what we could do with it if we're able to crack the code. And we're working very, very hard on that. So those are two that are sort of over the horizon, but very important to our nation's future.
And are you working with Canada and perhaps Mexico on these things?
Yes, absolutely. Both of them have been very, very important partners. On the nuclear side in particular, Canada and Mexico have been great partners. Mexico is not a big nuclear power, but Canada understands very clearly the role of nuclear in the electric generation side, but also for future energy uses as well. They've joined us, as a matter of fact, in an initiative that we announced in Copenhagen, Denmark, to ensure that countries understand the importance of nuclear to emissions and the importance of nuclear to meeting these environmental goals that particularly the European states have placed upon themselves. I think it's an important initiative. Canada's been a great partner in that, and we're going to continue to work very closely with them.
I have one other question that
Yes, sir.
in terms of energy, how do efficiency and conservation fit into the mix?
How do energy and conservation fit into the mix?
Efficiency.
Efficiency, I'm sorry. I thought you said energy.
Oh.
We want to continue. I mean, one of the things that's been so remarkable about our country's history here is that the economy has grown by leaps and bounds. Yet, and we use a lot more energy perhaps than we did in the future, but think about how much we would have used without the technologies that have been brought to market. It's been very, very important. Consumers have not seen great, prices have gone up on gasoline and things like that from time to time, but they've not seen the spikes that they would have seen without these technologies. So, from my days at Ford Motor Company, we talked a lot about energy efficiency, gasoline efficiency, CAFE rules, those types of things. I think that's what consumers want. And we need to continue to incentivize efficiency across the board in the auto industry, in the electric industry, everywhere that we can. And we're doing that at the department as well.
When you say incentivize, what are you talking about? What kind of things do you do to incent this?
You educate people, basically. I mean, that's what our role is at the Department of Energy. We're not a big fan of subsidizing, various types of energy. We want to be fuel neutral. That's, again, all of the above strategy. We don't want to pick and choose the winners, in the energy industry. We want to educate consumers about their choices. And I think when you do that, it provides an incentive for people to make good decisions. And we're seeing it. We're seeing it all across the spectrum.
Former Governor Ed Schaefer says I always got him in trouble when I would use this phrase, but I'm going to use it on you. Is there anything else that you would like to add?
Oh, boy. That is a very dangerous road to run down. No, simply to say thank you. As I travel the world over the course of the last few months and the last year or so, I have to tell you that the United States matters to a lot of people out there. You really do. You go to a developing country, you see what they do. there are still nearly 1 billion people in the world that do not have access to electricity. Think about that. 1 billion people in the world that do not have access to basic electricity. The work that you're doing here in the oil and gas fields, the work that you're doing here to make clean coal work is important to you, obviously, but it's also important to the rest of the world. So continue to do what you're doing. The world counts on you.
Those are the questions I had.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Great.
Mr. Secretary.
Thank you. Thank you to be here. Honor to be here.
Thank you, sir.
My name's Ron Day. I am the Public and Government Affairs person for Marathon Petroleum. It's a challenge for me to say that. It's been less than a week that we converted from our Endeavor, as you see on the program, to Marathon Petroleum. And as we talked earlier, Lieutenant Governor talked about biodiesel versus renewable diesel. Please don't mistake us with Marathon Oil. Completely separate. We're Marathon Petroleum. Well, it's with great pleasure that I get to introduce our next speaker. Dr. Dean Foreman was named Chief Economist of the American Petroleum Institute in December of 2017. He earned his PhD in economics from the University of Florida and brings more than 20 years of industry experience in corporate strategic planning, forecasting, risk management, and finance. Before joining API, Dr. Foreman was the lead economist for ExxonMobil Corp in planning between 2002 and 2008. From 2009 to 2013, he was a member of the executive team for a Canadian-based exploration petroleum company, Talisman Energy, up in Canada, where he focused on corporate planning, hedging, marketing, and business development. In 2013 and to 2015, he directed the risk management function in North America for a South African energy petrochemical conglomerate, Salsol, where he helped drive business cases for $25 billion in mega projects in the United States, including the $11 billion ethane cracker and derivatives complex in Lake Charles, Louisiana. Most recently, he was with Saudi Aramco Strategic Marketing Analysis in Dhahran, where he managed short-term marketing, monitoring, and long-term oil demand outlook. Dr. Foreman has continued to be published in peer-reviewed journals and is presented at the World Energy Congress, International Economic Forum of Americas, and the World Economic Forum. Before I bring him up on stage, one thing we would like to ask you, Dr. Foreman would definitely like your input throughout his presentation. He wants it to be interactive. So if you have questions, throw up your hand. We'll have microphones out there. If we don't get to you quick enough, just be patient so that everybody can hear the question. With that, Dr. Foreman.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you.
They'll mute the mic.
Good morning, and thank you. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. And honestly, this is my first time to North Dakota, so I'm really privileged to be able to join you and be part of a policy forum that's so forward-looking in terms of, it's refreshing when you go to all the various states. From the American Petroleum's, API, or American Petroleum Institute perspective, we are, as of next year, in existence for 100 years. Originally, we were the standard-setting organization for the industry. That's how it began. And today, we have some 700 standards that the industry uses as best practices domestically. We also have international offices and are sharing these standards globally to make sure things that are done to the best and highest standards around the world. Now, my role at API, part of it is communications, as I'm doing today. I sit in a policy and regulatory analysis group and really look at markets around the world and what's happening today and try to draw that together into what's important and give fact-based, data-based straight shots on this is what matters right now. I'm also part of the market development, and we do a lot of state and federal advocacy on different issues. And API is the largest trade association representing the natural gas and oil industry, some 640 member companies. So with that in the role, the important thing now the key points that I'd like you to take away, we have month after month this year celebrated record progress. And to highlight some of the things that were mentioned in the opening session, these are milestones that many people thought were impossible not long ago. So if we go back a decade, and I'll make comparisons, 10-year comparisons later in the presentation, we thought we were running out of oil. We thought we were running out of natural gas. We had prices that were, for oil in mid-2008, hitting close to $150 a barrel. Today, we're less than half that. On the natural gas side, we had prices above $10 per million BTU, and today we're like a third of that. All of this is the tremendous progress the U.S. has made, starting with the energy renaissance that's born in technology and innovation, American technology and innovation, enabling infrastructure, and frankly, a market structure here in the U.S. that up to this point is unique. Now, this year, as was mentioned before, we've become the world's largest oil producer. We've become the world's largest natural gas producer. We've hit records in terms of production of crude oil, of natural gas liquids for ourselves, but also compensated for losses of OPEC production so that we are supplying not only the world's entire oil demand growth, but compensating for OPEC at the same time. So as you have a strong global economy and one of these connections between global communities and local communities, I'm going to tell you a story about how this all ties together from North Dakota to the global markets, but also the manufacturing and economic renaissance that we've seen over the last 10 years. We have some challenges. As much as we have strong policy and policy leadership, we have infrastructure and continuing challenges in some states, and that was mentioned earlier. We also now have challenges on the trade front. So as we look toward markets, the exporting of crude, the raw materials, oil and gas and natural gas liquids, that's important. But also for the products that are made from those things, having free trade and all the messages that go with having those good trade relationships, both with our partners in Canada and Mexico, with China as it continues to be the world's largest growth market for many of these products, and developing Asia and developing markets as a whole. These are really important. Now, a key message here is that this market, if we went to the beginning of the summer and said, okay, where are we in Q3 from an oil market perspective globally, it actually looks pretty balanced. And I'll tell you why prices are up year to year. It largely is that we have such strong demand growth at home and abroad, and inventories have come down as a result of that. But you have, by EIA, or the part of the Department of Energy, the Energy Information Administration, by their estimation, the global market for oil is largely balanced. And until just a month or so ago, they were actually showing the market after second quarter moving to a surplus, not a deficit. Now they're showing it more as a prolonged deficit, meaning that the demand for oil is outstripping the supply of it, and that's helping bring down inventories and keep the prices solid. That benefits the investments that the industry continues to make here in North Dakota, the drilling activity that's made, everything in terms of innovation. And this last year, even within the industry, the way productivity has held up has been unexpected. So we've continued to see progress in productivity, process innovation, technical innovation that's brought down the break-even prices for the resource base. It's increased the recovery factors for the resource base. All of this is a bright outlook for North Dakota and for U.S. oil as a whole. So, as was mentioned earlier, North Dakota is producing currently about 1.2 million barrels per day. In the U.S. this last month, it hit a record for itself of 10.8 million barrels per day, and growing. These are things that, when you look at the EIA's outlook, says could double in the long run if we have the resource base and the technology and the enabling policies and infrastructure that we believe as industry that we do have. And consumers are also winning out of this. The numbers for North Dakota are shown here that between 2013 and 16, energy costs here in the state came down by $3.4 billion. That's 42% decline in energy costs for North Dakotans. So with that, let's delve in. Anything's fair game. In my career, I've been on the resource development side. I've also been on the manufacturing side in, as was mentioned, a petrochemical plant. So across the entire value chain for energy. I've worked a lot of years in Texas, some in Western Canada, up in Calgary, and last year in Saudi Arabia. So domestically and internationally as well. Especially looking at long-term energy demand, the notion of an all of the above energy strategy is really critical and important. When we look at how things are structurally changing and the policies and imperatives that will go with it, let's start with the transportation sector shown here. So 90% of transportation today, globally and at home, is oil-based. And given the sheer magnitude of it and the unique characteristics that oil brings in terms of its energy density, its embedded infrastructure, its availability, its abundance, and its affordability, all of these things, by not just an industry perspective, but analytically, whether it's the IEA, the EIA, any of the energy agencies that look thoughtfully at energy see oil and natural gas as critical to transportation for decades to come, despite what may happen with electrification, as we have member companies that turn the dial on the assumptions about how far and how fast electrification could happen. Natural gas and oil still play really important roles in that energy mix. Now, on the residential and commercial heating and cooling side, there's not a lot of growth there, and it continues with building efficiency standards to get more efficient over time. Electric power is where all the fuels compete head-to-head, and you see this interfuel competition between coal, nuclear, renewables, natural gas, and to a much lesser extent, oil. But natural gas in particular, the environmental progress that the United States has seen since 2005, where we now have emissions from CO2 emissions from a US perspective at 25-year lows, this is due almost entirely to natural gas supplanting coal in the power sector. It's been a really positive story. Now, when we look forward and we look at the EIA's outlook to 2040, there are challenges on the horizon in continuing to deliver those benefits if we don't have the market for natural gas. And the thing people often forget about is the materials side. So all of us who wear glasses, or you have contacts, or you go camping and you like sporty materials that are lightweight, strong, yet pliable, or you have a cell phone with you today, roughly half of that cell phone is, in one way, shape, or form, natural gas and oil. That, my friends, that is not going away. In fact, that is what the world wants more of, those materials, the consumer goods that everybody needs as they continue to move up the income chain. And that's another reason why oil and natural gas and the production here in North Dakota will be relevant for decades to come. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about the global economy and oil markets, less so on gas markets. This is a snapshot from 1990 to 2017 of global energy of all forms in quadrillion BTU versus global energy-related CO2, excuse me, said it wrong. This is the size of the global economy versus total energy of all forms. With the economy, you don't get any form of economic activity without having energy in some way, shape, or form to feed it. Over the trend, you'll see that they go in lockstep, but the energy part of it has more cyclicality to it than the economy has had. So if we break this into time periods, from 1995 to 2000, you had a lot of investment in service and information-oriented things in the economy. So it was relatively less energy intensive for that period. And as a result, the economy was growing faster than energy. After that period, after 2000 though, you see energy zoom back, and this is the effect of China and developing Asia. So the relevance of relatively energy intensive economies that were growing relatively more quickly. Now, you get to 2008 and 2009, and the greatest financial crisis the world has seen, the greatest recession on record, is just a blip from an energy perspective. This is really instructive as you're looking at our industry and saying, regardless of what happens to the economy, you need energy. It's absolutely essential. And since then, the energy and the economics have continued to converge back in lockstep. This is important in terms of understanding where we need to go from here. And for every 1% the global economy grows, we've been needing about 0.6% more of energy of all forms over the last 8 years. So what's happening right now? These are the headlines over the last quarter or so that really seem to matter. And as opposed to giving you a lot of economic charts, this is sort of a point of discussion for the things that are important on both the economic and the policy side. So let's start at the top, because the theme of of a roller coaster. It's going to start with John Kemp of Reuters. His global economic outlook is darkening. It's a little dramatic, but it's actually on par with the way the consensus sees it. And globally, the expectations are that over the next 2 years, in 2019 and 20, the economy should slow off of what's been a really strong period where we've seen a concerted upturn among all the regional economies for the first time since the financial crisis. Now, with the pressures that are happening on the trade side, China's economy is cooling. They're in triage mode. They are doing everything they can to try to hold growth and jobs together. Part of that has meant depreciating their currency. And as China takes that action, the whole basket of all the Asian currencies moves with it. So that's an important dynamic that's affecting the cost of debt globally, the ratings on that debt, and frankly, emerging markets, one by one. This statement of what happens in Turkey won't stay in Turkey, why this debt crisis could be different. Turkey that's one isolated thing, and what was different about Turkey, it has a distinctly corporate flavor, whereas for years we've been talking about sovereign debt as sort of being the trigger for what could be the next crisis. But Turkey's not alone. Argentina a few weeks ago went back to the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and asked for more money. Their currency has depreciated some 60% in a year. Then we move to Brazil. Brazil's also in crisis. Its currency is down 25% in a year. So how many of the BRICS, the real fundamental high-growth emerging economies, can we pull those legs out from under the table before we start to take notice and say that from a global perspective, this really matters and has the feedback effect all the way to the things that America produces, the energy that America produces and it exports. I love this one headline: you could take a roller coaster or just be holding Italian debt. That European debt crisis, the sovereign debt crisis, as much as it's not the highlight today, it will come back. It's just been kicked down the road. And Fitch, which is a debt rating agency like Moody's or S&P, Fitch came out not long ago and said, well, it won't be the trade war that hurts sovereign debt ratings, but the strength of the US dollar might. And this is really important. I don't know how many of you have heard of the Bank of International Settlements, but along with the IMF and the World Bank, the BIS, as it's called, follows the flow of money across borders in the banking system at a very detailed level. And there's some $3.5 trillion worth of US dollar denominated debt that's been growing since late last year at some 17% per year. So $3.5 trillion, the vast majority of which has been issued by offshore non-bank entities, not banks. So this isn't like 2008, the kind of financial crisis that was banking related and overnight debt that had to be refinanced in a very short period. This is stuff that has a longer tenure to it. But when it comes home to roost, some $450 billion of that is sitting in China today, largely offshore, and frankly, largely being squandered. So the principal isn't there to be repaid. It's keeping the doors opened on state-owned enterprises in a way, but it's not money that's going to be a fruitful investment that then generates income that can repay that debt. So these are the headwinds that when we look at and try to think about what's the end game out of all this, we've seen China respond to trade frictions by depreciating its currency. Now, why does that matter? Well, if you're exporting from the United States and the US dollar gets really strong, hitting close to 10-year highs right now, on the expectation that our interest rates are continuing to rise, if you're a petrochemical exporter, it's hard to compete with a really strong dollar. If you're a petrochemical exporter to China, and you now just hit it with another 25% tariff on top of it, you can't compete in China. Now, that's just petrochemical, but a lot of oil goes into that. A lot of the growth goes into this. So it all ties together. Please.
They're selling debt right now. China is selling debt right now. Could you comment on that and how it affects this whole thing?
So China's been a big purchaser of US Treasury securities in recent years, and it's helped frankly, keep our cost of debt down as a nation as we've run a budget deficit. It's also enabled them to kind of keep this symbiotic relationship, whereas they earn US dollars from their exports, they're sort of reinvesting that back. The term yield curve describes short-term versus long-term interest rates, and if you're plotting them up, what trend they tend to take. What's interesting is that as China and others have pulled back from their purchases of that, we've seen some responsiveness where it makes it kind of more difficult to see how the long-run expectations hold together. So if we took the period of 0 to 2 years and the yields on those, up until very recently, they looked just like they did before the financial crisis. Like you could plot it and they were almost identical. And then when you went from 2 years up to 30 years, you had this mapping where it was actually healthier looking in 2008 than it was today. Now, this most recent interest rate increase is helping kick those expectations for longer term rates up a bit, which I think is a good thing because it validates that we've got a good economy. If you don't have higher rates in the long term, your incentive to invest today, given that you could borrow money for 30 years the same as 2 years, gets a little bit perverse. So it's an indication. It's also China needing that money back at home. It's also China doing this triage. And frankly, there's an aspect where, to give some of the message away of what I'm going to show you, where China and India both have a little bit thumbed their middle finger toward the United States in terms of buying patterns of US oil right now. So in the last 2 months, we've seen a drop of US petroleum exports of some 1.3 million barrels per day. That's a takeaway. Now, whether that's consequential to North Dakota and US oil in the long run, we think that this is a pretty resilient and fungible market where oil can find a home. In the long run, we hope that's the case. But in the near term, our industry is feeling some pain as a result of it, and you've seen a pause in some of the drilling activity in the last couple of months as a result of that too. So when we talk to the administration, for example, about the China relationship and what's happening, they'll say, well, it's a negotiation. And I think that's right, but they're also going to observe something strategic out of it very soon, and that's that China has continued to depreciate its currency, which actually furthers the administration's concern that they're manipulating their currency. But they've depreciated the Chinese currency in response to these trade frictions to try to make themselves more competitive and keep the exports going. So this is a little bit of a tangent, but if the administration's ultimate goal is to contain China, and let's face it, the US energy renaissance has been a big enabling factor for both the domestic agenda and the international agenda, and you heard that in the opening session. At some point, they'll realize that China is continuing to depreciate in a way that at some point it becomes less attractive for US and other international companies to go take a joint venture where they have to give away almost half the business and transfer technology in that process. So the end game actually could end up being successful with this, but we just have some pain points in the transition. Thank you. Any other questions before we go on to global oil markets? Please.
Obviously, here in North Dakota, natural gas is a big issue in terms of getting it out of the state, finding other alternatives for it. You talked about Brazil and some of the other countries that are in economic financial crisis, if you will. How does that play into us building LNG facilities and exporting that natural gas to other countries, if you will? If they're, on the back end, are they going to be able to do anything with that material if their economies are not growing?
Okay. That's a fantastic question. Let me start with a little bit more context of everything that I'll tell you about oil markets globally. We're talking about 2% global growth. US natural gas, we're talking about 12% growth in 1 year, summer to summer for third quarter, 12% growth, and we've seen the prices go down in the process. And part of that is finding markets. So just like on the oil side, where this innovation and technology has been unlocking the productivity, and it's been fantastic, you're also seeing that on the gas side. It was stated in the opening session that we only think about natural gas as a byproduct of oil. And for the years where we've had the price downturn with oil, for the last few years, we actually have talked about gas that way. But what's changed in the last 12 months is with these productivity and process breakthroughs, we have a resurgence in dedicated gas drilling that we haven't had in years, really since before the prices fell out of bed in 2012. So at $3 per million BTU, the break-evens in many places are now below $2 per million BTU in much of Pennsylvania, in Ohio, and in the Haynesville Formation if you're going down to Texas and Louisiana. So fully 60% of the gas growth that we're seeing is from a resurgence in those areas with distinct state flavors. That's a great story for innovation and coming back, but now let's look at what happens on the domestic side and now the LNG side, as you've asked, for the demand for that. On the domestic side, we're really competing head-to-head for market share that's been hard-won in the power sector. And you have the headwinds of potential subsidies for alternative forms, plus the mandates on renewables, so it minimizes the headroom for growth there. On the residential commercial side, with the building efficiency standards, very minimal growth. Industrial growth, there is some. But altogether, if 9 to 10 billion cubic feet per day, or that 12% increase, is what's been possible for US natural gas in this last year, the EIA over the next 22 years only sees, in its reference case, one more year like that in the next 22. So you turn now to LNG exports and you say, how much more of that could you see with a slew, almost, to put it in perspective, the EIA might expect that maybe 17 billion cubic feet per day of exports happens over the next 2 decades, but there's more than twice that much in terms of projects. So a lot of projects that now the initial wave has gone in. The initial wave is also competing against projects that have been in the pipe from Australia, some from others from the US and other places. Mozambique's coming. So being cost competitive is really, really important because this is the first wave where LNG's actually been leveraged off of shale gas. That doesn't happen anywhere else. So it's unique to the United States. The competitiveness, the reliability of it, and that sustainability in the policy regime to make it so that companies can make these credible commitments over 10, 20 years, getting those contracts is really important. So if Asia is your biggest growth market for LNG, Europe is minimal growth in terms of gas, largely supplied. It's really only off the decline of Groningen and other domestic gas fields that you might get some growth in LNG going in there. Latin America and other emerging economies, as you mentioned, really important. So LNG, what makes you sell that? Price competitiveness is one ingredient, but it's not the only one. Security of supply, especially in Asia, is really important to getting those contracts. And a project that might be deemed by some to be unlikely can become locked in, credible, and going full bore with infrastructure, investment, everything tomorrow if it gets the right combination of things to move. So often that means, though, partnering with your buyer in Asia in a credible way, in a trustful way, where they trust that they're going to have a trade relationship with the United States that can last decades, and they're not going to get steered off course as part of that progress. So these are some of the challenges that, in addition to price, are really important to, when you go to an LNG conference, of making sure that those trustful trade relationships can be built when you're competing neck and neck against a market that's pretty amply supplied at this point in time. So I hope that helps. So enough on natural gas. Let's get on to oil. Okay. So oil is near and dear to North Dakota's heart and to the US in terms of the record production. Supply and demand. As the economy here has done so well, oil demand has blown away all of the expectations that the agencies had in terms of growth. And for the last 2 years, it's really not only exceeded those, but it's sort of shown that the forecasting from some of the international agencies in particular has had a consistent overlay of wishful thinking that oil would go away. And it hasn't. Even as prices have gone up this year, we've seen some 600,000 barrels per day of growth here in the US. That's phenomenal. Now, OPEC, and this is a heat map. Green means this concept's gone up, red means it's gone down. If it's a bolder color, it's in the top 25% or bottom 25% in terms of movement versus the last 5 years. Now, OPEC going down mildly year to year, some of it is almost unavoidable. So you have an economic and human tragedy that's been working itself out in Venezuela. That's not likely to be fixed, and they're down some 600,000 barrels per day in 1 year. Angola quietly is off by 300,000 barrels per day. Saudi Arabia has been asked and has stepped up production in some months to try to compensate for some of this, but OPEC's still down year to year. So here's the US now compensating for that and more. That's phenomenal because the US is now the world's swing producer when it comes to oil. And with deliverability, short-term deliverability that's changed, these aren't just barrels that are sitting there necessarily ready to go tomorrow, but within 3 to 6 months, with a ramp up of drilling activity, we can deliver crude oil in ways that were impossible a few years ago. It's tremendous progress. Now, as growth abroad and at home has continued to exceed those expectations, we've also now brought inventories down to the middle of the 5-year range. This is really important because it's still ample, but it has been enough where we're riding some of the geopolitical things that have happened globally. And as was mentioned earlier, some of this domestic versus international crude prices, we're seeing international prices now pushing, say, $84, $85 per barrel compared to with domestic ones that are $10 a barrel less. This is a discount US consumers get only by virtue of having strong production here at home. In terms of other indicators, we've mentioned the US dollar and the fact that it's continued to get stronger. And then we have this combination of very stimulative policies. So it's infrastructure spending, it's deficit spending, it's the tax cut. Many of these are structural for the US economy, and it's a really great story. So when the administration comes out and says, we've done fantastically well, we've delivered the best economy in modern history, by the numbers, that's right. It's on par. The one concern that we in industry have is that we've also accelerated a lot of activity into the second and third quarter this year by virtue of people anticipating that interest rates would rise. So the housing market, you buy before it goes up. The tariffs, expecting those tariffs on China over this year. I can see in the fuel data when we look monthly, the acceleration outside of normal seasonality and marine activity and air freight. These are things that boost it right now, but we have to expect now what's going to happen and look at that. And I'll show you some economic numbers for the US in a little bit here. So let's look at the global now supply-demand balance for oil markets as a whole and the way the EIA looks at it. This chart's structured where the blue line or blue blocks above the line, above the axis, that's where supply is exceeding demand. When that happens, you'd expect prices to come down, and the red line shows the international crude prices, Brent crude oil. From the end of 2014 through the third quarter or so of 2016, that's exactly what happened. The market was oversupplied. OPEC started to behave competitively, flooded with the barrels that they had onto the global market, and prices came down considerably as a result of that, down into the $30 per barrel kind of range. But over the last 5 consecutive quarters, and now going forward, the EI's assessment is that the market has been and will continue to be in now a slight deficit. And I mentioned a little bit ago that the EIA was expecting that this market would actually return to a surplus. So without any gymnastics by OPEC, without any request or ask of OPEC, we of the US have compensated for everything, enough to the point where we've put out, in terms of crude oil, natural gas liquids, biofuels, refinery gain, all the forms of liquid fuels, more than 2 million barrels per day of growth. Actually closer to 2.5. That's phenomenal. And all of world oil demand growth, by the way, by whether IEA or EI assessments, is only sitting around 1.7 or 1.8 million barrels per day. So there are several 100,000 barrels per day of excess capacity that the US is producing. And as long as the global economy and the US economy continues to hit on all cylinders, it will be needed. So now let's look at a snapshot of 2008 versus 2018, because I think it's stark. Our production of crude oil in the US has more than doubled. Our natural gas production has gone up considerably. In fact, and this is total gas production, so at the wellhead, gross withdrawals, including natural gas liquids. But we hit these 2 milestones where on the oil side for the world, for the very first time, we've got demand of 100 million barrels per day, and the US supplying more than 10% of that. And then on the gas side, this number of 98.5, we're right there near 100 billion cubic feet per day in the amount that we're producing here domestically. At the same time, 2018 compared with 2005 levels, our emissions, our CO2 emissions have continued to come down rather dramatically. And this is, as I mentioned before, largely natural gas pushing into the power sector. On the net import side, we've made tremendous progress. Instead of double-digit million barrels per day, 11 million barrels per day that we were a net importer of at that point, Year to date, on average, down to 3.2. This is phenomenal. As of June, it actually got down to like 2.6. As of July, it was back to 2.9. It increased a little bit. Then we went to August, and well, we were up to 4.5 suddenly. So the 1.3 million barrel per day loss of exports that I mentioned earlier, coupled with an increase of imports on top of it. So this, in 2 months, we reversed what had been a year's worth of progress on our petroleum trade balance. This is important, and we need to watch this space. We don't have destination-specific trade data just yet, but it's coming months. As we get that, we'll have a very clear picture of exactly what's driving it. The jobs supported, our industries continued to grow, and you see that here in North Dakota in a vibrant way. Crude prices, instead of $100 a barrel, we're talking on average for the year $66.50. And today a little bit higher than that, but we'll see how that plays out. Natural gas at Henry Hub, instead of $9, we're talking 3 or below. So 3 or below now for 4 consecutive years. So the price levels and the volatility in those prices has also been diffused. So let's look a little bit more at what that production trend has meant. This is a comparison of crude oil in the US, crude oil and natural gas liquids, the production increase that you see in blue, and going through waves. And think about the price downturn that happened, again, starting at the end of 2014, and you see how production leveled off and went down, and you felt that here locally in North Dakota. But then the resurgence since then, for this last year, which is phenomenal, and the productivity that's enabled it as the industry tightened its belts was not altogether expected. And then in the red line, you see the decrease in petroleum net imports, how this is cyclically and structurally continued to come down. There's been some variation in it. And then, as I mentioned, this blip up just in the last couple of months, which is the ask, and we need to figure out from a policy perspective whether it's more systemic. Now, let's drive it home for what it means for North Dakota. The Bakken, in terms of its production growth, the Bakken and the Permian, those basins have been the biggest sources of growth in the US. There is some other growth, but from an oil perspective, this is where the bread and butter is for delivering for industry. And the right-hand side showing the break-even for prices, this is from BTU Analytics, their estimation of it. It's phenomenal. We've gone from needing $60 to $80 per barrel in different oil-related plays to being in the 40 to 50 range. So this says at these prices, industry will continue to drill, continue to invest, continue to grow, and make progress that enables the production growth that you'll see here locally. How much have we invested? Over 10 years? This adds up to $2.5 trillion on behalf of our industry, natural gas and oil together. This is infrastructure of all sorts, from the upstream in terms of the oil and gas development that you see here at home, the pipelines and the critical infrastructure that enables the egress of that, refineries, which have been expanded, even as our number of refineries has continued to come down to some 135 of them now domestically, the production is still up considerably over time. We had new record US refinery throughput of more than 18 million barrels per day this year. That's a new milestone. And at the same time, it's been achieved where we've seen months where we've only had 100,000 to 200,000 barrels per day of outages among refineries, even as they do turnarounds. That's a record as well. So the industry is doing some things right here. New LNG projects, these exports, it's not just about the projects that have been enabled already, it's about making sure that there and on the petrochemical side, as the first wave of those happen, that those business cases are validated, because that's what will open the gates to further investment going forward that is absolutely critical from a market perspective to make sure that the US energy renaissance continues. Now, what are the headwinds? Section 232, the raising of tariffs 25% on steel, 10% on aluminum. Steel is the biggest input in terms of building a lot of these very capital-intensive projects. It's not just raising the cost of it. We have projects, critical ones in this industry, where we can't even get the equipment that we need. So you have quotas in lieu of tariffs for Brazil, for Argentina, for South Korea, for certain economies. And Their quotas were established historically on what they've imported. So if these are once-in-a-generation things that have come along, where we've got a new wave of refineries, a new wave of pipes and petrochemical plants that hasn't been invested in before, this may not be equipment that Brazil, for example, has exported to the United States in the last 3 years. So Brazil effectively got from the US Trade Representative a quota of 0. That means a ban on exports from Brazil to the United States of those steel products. And for oil country tubular goods, that's a really important piece of our industry. Reduce global market access. We've talked about China already. Unlike oil, which is really fungible, and what we would expect on oil markets to see, by the way, as trade restrictions and other tensions rise, is a shift in buying patterns perhaps away from the US. We think we're seeing that with India and China both. But at a discount, somebody else will take those barrels of crude. That's a pretty resilient, fungible market. LNG is different. LNG, these are big contracts, longer-term contracts. To underpin a big new $5 to $10 billion project, you've got to get the financing that goes with it. And outside of the largest companies, most entities are using financing to do this. To have contracts that will underpin and motivate that investment going forward, you have to have the market. So it's not so easy to turn around and find the alternate buyer of LNG when China and developing Asia is such a big part of that. Now, we've made tremendous progress, and API applauds what's happening with the US-Mexico-Canada trade agreement. We hope that that moves forward and gets ratified by Congress, but if it didn't, that's a tremendous thing for our industry, which, as you know here, is so integrated between Canada, the US, and Mexico from a supply chain perspective, with crude moving back across the border, refined products moving back and forth across the border. All of this is really important from an economic perspective. And lastly, as I've already touched on, the US dollar and hitting its strength just broadly makes, for not only our industry, but US manufacturers in general, makes it harder to export. So now, let's take this back, the $2.5 trillion of investment over 10 years, and say, what's this mean for the US economic outlook? Well, the expectations, the current growth, and the Bloomberg consensus expectations are shown on the left by the blue bars. So notice, first off, the administration's target is 3% growth, and to sustain that as far as the eye can see. With the tax reform, with capital expensing, there's some really great things that have been done that are helping to approach that. Now, the number for second quarter was growth of 4.2% on a quarter-to-quarter basis. Basically, the math and the way that works, inside economics baseball, if you will, is you take the quarter-to-quarter growth and you basically multiply by 4 with a little bit of compounding. And that gets you to this estimation of, that's the number you see in the headlines of 4.2. But most of the world doesn't look at quarter-to-quarter growth. They look at the last quarter compared with the same quarter 1 year ago. And you look on a year-to-year basis, and US growth was really 2.8% for the second quarter, and it was more like 2.1% for the first quarter. So if we're going to get up to the administration's goal of at least 3% growth and sustain that, and now recall what I mentioned a moment ago about having accelerated a lot of activity, if that starts to drop off, the consensus usually, on average, isn't that far off. And what they're seeing is in 2019 and 20, they would expect that there'd be roughly 0.5% growth each year in the next 2 years for the US broadly. This may not be a recession technically, but it sure will feel like one compared with the good times and the cyclical high that we have right now. So this is the concern of how do we keep this going? And the way we keep this going is investment and growth and markets and making sure that internationally that we're complementing the growth that we've seen that's been so strong regionally. Now, state by state, and I apologize that North Dakota's at the bottom, but whether I use 2017 data coming out of the price downturn for oil and the activity that's been seen here, most of the energy producing states have been killing it. They've done really well, and the US average has also done really well. North Dakota has lagged for multiple reasons, but right now is seeing a resurgence thanks to this resilience in oil prices, and the break-evens that I showed you earlier having come down are also helping industry activity. To keep the infrastructure and investment and benefit North Dakota, it's those enabling policies that have to continue to move forward and make progress. Now, as you know, in addition to the Bakken and the oil and gas development here in North Dakota, It's a big infrastructure state, and it's critically important to our industry, both from a crude oil basis, which enables the egress from the Bakken and connects it to the Mid-Continent refining complex, but also with Alliance and Northern Border, these big gas pipes that are the nexus for the US and Canadian gas markets. Without that, you wouldn't have the competition that's been benefiting consumers on the natural gas side. And it's interesting because in the first 5 months of the year, Canadian gas imports were actually up during the winter period. But since then, we've seen a massive backing out of Canadian imports as this resurgence in dedicated gas drilling has continued to just kill it. So we've got sub $2 break-evens on the natural gas side, and that's also helping US become more competitive versus its neighbor. And then I think the good long-term story for North Dakota in particular, but also the Permian Basin, is that if we take the EIA's high oil and gas resource and technology case, and as industry, we firmly believe that we see the resource estimates going up each year. We see the progress, the tremendous progress that's been made in terms of productivity over the last year. As that happens, this means that we could be producing 15 to 20, well, certainly more than 15 million barrels per day by 2040. This is a great American success story in terms of technology, in terms of economic growth, and the 10.3 million jobs that we support nationwide today can continue to grow with another 1 or 2 million opportunities between now and 2030. Now locally, here for North Dakota, I mentioned at the outset that those costs had come down some 42%, or $3.4 billion on energy spending just in the last few years. Now the latest data from EIA that we have for state expenditures on energy is only 2016. This is capturing some of the oil price downturn, but it's also oil and gas, and you can see sector by sector how it's added up. A lot of it's in transportation, 2/3 of it, but the industrial sector is also benefiting. Residential commercial consumers are also benefiting. So it's a good story from a consumer standpoint. It's a good story from a business standpoint. And when the administration looks at its domestic and international agenda and takes stock of the policies, everything that's happening in terms of infrastructure, access to resources, smart regulation, those are all phenomenal. And again, have been unexpected by industry even a few years ago. So this is tremendous progress. Our only ask, really outside of some technical details in those areas, is then we're looking at the market access and saying, let's not forget about that, because the proverbial tail can wag the dog when it comes to having markets for our energy, and that backs the way all the way up to the oil and gas resource development here in North Dakota. So that concludes my prepared slides. I'm happy to take questions on anything that you have on about energy and on your mind.
I'll go ahead and start with one that was texted in. Does OPEC still have the ability to influence our oil market the same way that it did a few years ago?
It's certainly evolved. It's gone through a transition in the periods that I mentioned where they changed their competitive behavior at the end of 2014, where OPEC held a meeting and said, no, we're going to stop restraining output. And for a period, they unleashed barrels. They only had so many, and that forced the industry here to really tighten its belt. Then they moved, as of the third quarter of 2016, to start to take 1.6 million barrels per day, together with Russia, off the market. And that was part of the stabilization of the market as a whole, and that supply-demand balance and pricing. Now we move forward today, though. OPEC did not expect that the US could deliver 2 million barrels per day or more of growth in 1 year. There's no way. And having been in Saudi Arabia, I can tell you that wasn't the expectation. So we continue to exceed in a way where the US, this vision of energy dominance and moving forward and having more influence on the global theater is absolutely positive and happening. OPEC still has some influence, though, and largely because the international agenda. If we weren't taking Iranian crude oil off the market right now, the market would be more than amply supplied. So out of the almost 5 million barrels per day or so that Iran produces, if you start, let's say you've got a high degree of compliance in the United States and in Europe, the larger refiners in India are raising their hands and saying to get the waiver that they'll comply. But China, largely not so much. And in India, not so much, especially when India quietly gets very favorable commercial terms from Iran directly. So it's hard to break those linkages. And if you put pressure on it, though, enough where it takes 1 million barrels per day or more off of the market, that matters. That difference in terms of global production actually matters. Now, the U.S., with continued investment, if it expects the price to be in a certain range, will continue to drill, will continue to make this progress. And I think we see just that all of the plays, oil plays across North America, really work well in this kind of price range. So it is, I think it's an empirical question of time to see just how much long-run influence OPEC has. They're betting on a longer game where they're saying a lot of the big deep sea offshore projects that industry historically has invested in have come off. And if you get some help on the economic side, where maybe it just moderates a bit and doesn't turn down markedly or continue to be as hot as it has been, if that happens, this holds together. And this is why the EIA and others see a relatively balanced market today without, again, any gymnastics by OPEC. Other questions?
All right, there was one other that was texted in. A little bit earlier in your presentation, you had talked about how much petroleum and natural gas is used in our everyday life, and you had specifically mentioned cell phones. As the anti-oil crowd gets louder, will that have an impact on our standard of living?
Well, as the anti-oil crowd makes a call on the cell phone that's made of oil and gas. I mean, in all seriousness, we as an industry recognize that there are risks associated with climate change, and we see at the state level the push to try to increase renewables. But 100% renewables is not economically or even technically feasible with today's technology at anything that would not kill the economy. There was a paper out of University of California, Davis, that preceded California's recent action of trying to mandate that you get to 100% renewables in power, for example, that said, well, we could get to 80%. That was only 80%, not 100% as the mandate's turning toward. But they didn't address the trillions of dollars of expenditures that would be necessary either for battery storage or grid interconnections or demand-side management, trying to do things that fundamentally change it. And here we go through these periods where you get local opposition that sometimes is funded more than locally, that's relatively well organized, that's trying to oppose infrastructure of all sorts, including renewables, by the way. So as that happens, we need as an industry to make sure that we're doing things right, holding to best practices, continuing to deliver the energy in a responsible way. We have more energy than we know what to do with, both on the oil and the gas side, and now it's a question of continuing to make it go. Being good corporate citizens is part of that, and what we're doing is API's environmental partnership, having our member companies collaborate in ways that also reduce our direct methane emissions. All of that, I think, helps speak to the progress that we're trying to make that helps assuage some of those concerns from that community.
I've been getting a couple. In your view as an economist, not a scientist, how likely is it that electric utilities and oil producers will use carbon capture for enhanced oil recovery?
Well, for enhanced oil recovery, as the opening panel was discussing, there's a strong business case for that. So it depends on the locale. It has to be complementary with both capturing the CO2, having the infrastructure to move it, and then the case to put it in. Tax incentives and policy can also play a role in that, but it is economic. Now, when I worked for Sasol on the Lake Charles chemical project, this is an world-class ethane cracker and derivatives complex that's starting up right now. We had a CO2 pipeline going right next to the field, or to the plant. This is a brownfield plant, an existing ethane cracker with the addition of a new one. With the capital cost to capture CO2, even with the existing infrastructure for the CO2 pipeline right next to the property, it was really hard to make the case work. There was almost no way. So that's the challenge, is if you have market failure on that, how do you make that go? So policy also plays a role there, and we'll have to see. But from an EOR perspective, definitely in the Permian, definitely here, and that'll continue to increase the recovery factors over time. Other questions? Any?
I've got one more that was texted in.
Okay.
Talk about your experience working in Saudi Arabia. What did you learn, and what is their perception of North Dakota's energy growth?
So working for the national oil company in Saudi Arabia is it's like working for the United Nations. You have colleagues from everywhere and really good resources, actually, and surprisingly. Living there is different from working there. But from a work perspective, I would say that what you learn is a lot of things about the global oil market that are both how the quota is done, what kind of forward-looking information exists. It completes the knowledge from the things that, from a U.S. industry perspective, you would almost never see. So, it's a very powerful producer with great resources, great ability to deliver a challenging political environment, obviously, and an economic environment that has continued to evolve, and a lot of things politically that are happening in the region. So, look, I would say that what it's done is complete my perspective, but it's also reinforced my confidence that oil and gas will be here to stay. So I see it as a positive story where industry, from an all of the above energy perspective, is continuing to have to pull up its bootstraps, tighten its belt, but also deliver in a way that it's never delivered before, because global energy and oil demand is hitting highs that it's never hit before. So thank you so much. On API's website, www.api.org, our quarterly industry outlook, our monthly statistical report, I'll plug that and say there's a chief economist section that's right there in the upper right, and that is where you can get our latest outlooks and materials. Thank you.
All right, and before we take our lunch break, I want to thank our gold sponsors this year, Touchstone Energy Cooperatives of North Dakota, Excel Energy, and All Eat. For lunch, the buffet will be out in the registration area. You can go ahead and get in line and serve yourselves, and we'll start up the afternoon part of our program at 1 o'clock. Thank you.